Make sure you got it. Hi, guys. How are you?
Yeah, Joe Bridgman from Livingston County. How are you?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for, hope you enjoyed chatting with your colleagues. It was nice to have some time to just socialize. Hi, Nancy. Hi. We're just doing a quick check to see who's on the phone. But welcome. Thank you, everyone.
You go.
Okay.
Go for
Are
it.
you set with the phone?
I think we are.
Okay. And can everyone on the phone hear me? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here today. A lot has happened since we last convened as a group. I know you've been doing a lot of work in the committees, and thank you, Chris and Jonathan, for working to keep the things moving and lead us forward. There's already been a lot of utility for the advice that you've given us. It's been extremely helpful. So thank you for being at this table. Thank you for advising us. Thank you for being willing to not just be a part of this, but also be our ambassadors to others who are not in this room, and gleaning their input as well. We're going to continue to rely on you and your advice and your input as we move towards with further implementation. I know we've got a packed agenda today to talk about. In particular, since we last spoke, we've had an election. Our May 7th election was our first election under the new constitutional protections of Proposal 3. I know we'll have some time, particularly to hear from our election administrators here today about how that election went in your communities. We already have some interesting data that Sally Williams and our Bureau of Elections will be sharing. I'll just highlight a few points right now that I think are really promising and informative. Sort of 2 points. One, we had more than 400 people register on election day in the May election across the state, and 300 or so in the 14 days prior to the election. So for a low turnout election, that's 700 eligible voters who wanted to vote and would not have been able to do so without these new protections, which I think is really exciting, and it really, to me, underscores and drives home the real work that we're all doing. I mean, these are citizens. A lot of them, over half of them, were young voters. One of them was, I think, Sally's brother,
Yep.
Who showed up in Grand Rapids to register and vote. I mean, these are people who had a voice, who wanted to be heard, who wanted to cast a ballot, and they were able to do so because of the changes in the law. And so that only bodes well for the future, but also I think underscores that we need to be ready for 10 times, if not more, of that happening next year with the major elections we have in 2020 coming our way. So our work is significant, will make a difference, but it's also a sobering statistic because it shows us that we've got to be ready for the wave that's coming. We also saw where our traditional numbers, as you all know, are about a third voting absentee. We went up to half of the voters in the May election voted from home, voted by mail, or absentee, whatever language you want to use. And that also shows that we're on track to see the same type of movement that other states who've gone in this direction have experienced, which is, I fully anticipate that if not next year, soon after, we'll have 2/3 of our voters voting from home and voting by mail. And so we have to think about what that means for resource allocation and for counting of the ballots and securing those ballots and really making sure our election administrators across the state are prepared for that shift that frankly may come in March with our presidential primary. And we know the added, those of you who have been doing this for a while, the added pressure that comes with getting the results accurately and efficiently communicated to the public. We've already had Detroit News and others reach out to us about how that's going to work on election nights next year. And so the pressure is on. The opportunity is great because it's a great thing to see so many more people voting and voting in a convenient way. But I think the impetus and the onus is on us to get this right and to get it right quickly. And to that, because of our decentralized system here in Michigan, the onus is also on us to really communicate at the grassroots level to our 1,580 or 60 township clerks, our 83 county clerks, those who aren't in the room, but those who are represented here. We need your help communicating to them that this change is in the law now. We've got to prepare for it. We've got best practices, and we know how to prepare for it, and we need their collaboration, input, and partnership in meeting the needs of the electorate that will be apparent next year. That also, I think, underscores the importance of this committee because your credibility and your voice is going to be important to talking to all those stakeholders and election officials who aren't in the room to prepare for next year and to implement these things well. What gives me hope is that we all know, and those of you who've done this in other states know, that the answers are there, the best practices are out there. Those people have gone through this already and can tell us how to avoid pitfalls that they experienced. We've just got to build that bridge between that experience and wisdom and our implementation on the ground with a dose of kind of local Michigander unique input as well. So we have 3 goals out of today's meeting, and thank you again for giving up your time for being here. We'll do a quick round of introductions and intros of those on the phone next. But just to lay out the goals for today, number 1, by the end of today, I hope we will have mostly identified the set of voting reforms and improvements that we as a committee want to examine going forward. So we'll hone in on the changes that we want to make administratively and legislatively. Doesn't we don't need a specific decision on each item, but we want to be in a position to know what reforms the committee, this group, will consider recommending beyond the obvious Prop 2 or Prop 3 implementation issues with Promote the Vote. That will also include voter tools, opportunities for other legislative improvements like pre-registration or military voting, which we're going to talk about, poll worker training as well, which we're also starting to take on as a talent recruitment and education initiative, where we're essentially trying to identify talent and identify the best ways to train that talent to work at the polls or work in the administrative or the absentee ballot counting boards throughout the state next year, and what that means and how we partner with our local communities to get them the best talent and get them a fully educated workforce of poll workers moving forward. So that's the first goal of today, really getting clarity on what those reforms and recommendations are going to be so that we can start delving into the details there. Second, I'm hoping we can get a little bit more specific on the data our clerks will need to prepare for 2020 and the most effective way of getting that information out. We've already had some interesting numbers like I've talked about. We'll have more opportunities with 2 more local elections this year, one in August and one in November, to gather more data. But I remain hopeful and convinced that every single clerk in the state and election administrator wants to have a successful election next year. And it's on us to support them with the tools and resources and data that we can collect to make sure they can succeed. And then finally, I hope we'll have a more specific work plan for the remainder of this committee's time. We're going to hear about the subcommittees and your reports today. We also have an opportunity to utilize those subcommittees in the future to examine some issues we identify today in more depth. But as we get closer to 2020, I want to have a timeline and a specific work product that will capture this committee's recommendations so that we can begin with implementation. We know your time is valuable, so what we do today will really, I think, drive the substantive work and output of this committee forward. So thank you again for participating and sharing your insights. I'm looking forward to being a part of the discussions today. I can't say enough how grateful I am that you're willing to be a part of this journey with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to our chair, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary. She's kind of laid out exactly what our agenda is for today in terms of these 3 areas that we want to really focus on and really start to look towards a document that'll come down the road with your recommendations and actually moving the ball forward. Some of it may be legislative, some may be administrative, but clearly a lot of it's going to be data. And the first data point I would throw at you is look at the presidential primary turnout. Okay, that's going to be the big first statewide election. And we had 35%, 2.5 million turned out in 2016, which was a big jump from any previous presidential primary. Even 08, which was kind of half participation in terms of the candidates, was only 21%. So keep that in mind, because that's the first one where you're going to really have to do your estimates on how many AV ballots to have prepared, what your staffing is going to look like for dealing with election day and the 14 days before. So it's those kind of things that I know the Bureau's looking at, in terms of data points that will help election officials prepare. And so that's one thing we're going to be seeking from all of you is what should those be and how can we hone in and make sure that this runs as smoothly as possible. These are major changes to how we've run elections, and it's going to be incumbent upon the election officials to step up to it. Chris Swope and Janice Winfrey have run satellites out of their offices, which is a major change in terms of outreach to the community. Many of you will have the same opportunities to do that, and so we've got great people that you can learn from. So really looking forward to seeing this through. And then finally, Prop 3 is just sort of a jump-off point. You know, what does it tell us we need further? You know, early processing of AV ballots, because we're going to shift to an AV election here, at least I would guess 50%, at least in 2020. So that's going to really shift workloads and pressures on election officials to get unofficial returns out on election night and all of that. So there's much that flows from the proposition itself and the obligations that it places on local government. So with that, I thank you all for participating, both in person and on the phone. Just as housekeeping as we go along, I'm a timekeeper today. I promised Jonathan I would keep to I've got an agenda here with minutes on it. So use your cards when you want to pipe in, and we will get a phone for people a number for people on the phone to text.
Yeah.
When.
Want me to give it right now?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So text Sally Marsh. My number is
And Sally will email that out to everyone on the phone as well so that you have it.
Right. So we want participation from as much as possible. So try to keep your comment.
That text, that number, are we to text that when we want to make a comment?
Yes, if you would do that, and then we'll get you in the queue and call on you.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, you don't need to text your comment. Just text your name and, you know, that you want to make. Just send your name in, and I think we'll get you on there.
Yeah.
Great. So again, thank you for being here. We'll do a quick run through around the table. So I'm Chris Thomas, and I'm retired.
Not anymore. Not until 2022 at least.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's going to go longer than that. Go ahead, Lori.
I'm Lori Bourbonnais. I am the manager of the Election Liaison Section at the Bureau of Elections.
Jenny Vanderhurst, Manager of Training and Communications for the Bureau of Elections.
Next year, Matero quasi-retired.
Marta Gonzalez Cortez, Vice President of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation.
Julia Stone Street. I'm the Spring Arbor Township Clerk. Spring Arbor is in Jackson County.
I'm Mary Katowski, the St. Clair Shores City Clerk in Macomb County.
I'm Robin Troyer. I'm the Deputy City Manager and City Clerk in City of Sault Ste. Marie, which is in Chippewa County.
Spencer, a Legal Redress Chair for the Michigan State NAACP.
I'm Matthew Weil. I'm the Director of the Elections Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C.
I'm Natalie Tennant with the Brennan Center for Justice, and I advocate for automatic voter registration, and I'm also former Secretary of State of West Virginia.
I'm Joe Roselle, the Director of Elections for Oakland County.
Nancy Waters, the Muskegon County Clerk.
Elizabeth Hundley, Livingston County Clerk.
Continuing with County Clerk Rowe, this is Justin Roebuck, Ottawa County Clerk.
I am Terry Williams, Bureau of Elections Program Development Manager.
Quisenberry, Center for Civic Design.
Sharon Delente, Voting Rights Strategist at the ACLU of Michigan.
I'm Jackie Boudry. I'm the City Clerk in Ann Arbor, and we're in Washtenaw County.
I'm Benjamin Marentet, and I serve as City Clerk in Traverse City.
Chris Swope, I'm the City Clerk of the City of Lansing.
Mary Clark, I'm the Delta Township Clerk.
I have Jonathan Bader. I'm the Legal Policy Director for Secretary of State Benson. I'm also going to take the liberty of giving a shout out to all the staff from Secretary of State and interns and the Bureau of Elections that we have with us today.
Also, just a couple of quick program notes. Unfortunately, Sally Williams, you may notice, is not with us. She has a really bad bug, and she's sorry she can't be here, but she definitely needs to get better. But we're in capable hands with Chris and all of our BOE staff. And then we're going to have, so I want to make sure people on the phone announce themselves too, and then we're going to go into a presentation on sort of the recap of the election and some other things. We're going to ask Lori and the BOE staff to kind of go through that, and then we'll have a period when people can ask questions about that presentation. And then I did, for those who are not in the room, I did email out the slides. So we will do our best to kind of let you know what slide we're on. But just so you know, you can go through on your computer and sort of go along with us as we're going through the slides. And that's for the whole day.
Okay, let's start with Amber.
Oh, yeah.
Folks on the phone?
Folks on the phone. David?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
So you've got
Amber, are you with us?
David Becker on the phone, Amber McReynolds from Vote at Home. Are you there?
Well, Janice Winfrey, City of Detroit is here.
Hi, Clerk
George
Winfrey.
Azu, City of Detroit.
Okay.
Anyone else on the phone?
I don't think Trey's on yet.
Tina Avery,
Joe.
Detroit.
Detroit
Joe
represented.
Bridgman from Livingston County, Elections Director.
All right, Livingston. Great. Anyone else?
Hi, Chanel Jackson, City of Detroit.
Hi,
And
Chanel.
Alicia Brown, City of Detroit. Yeah, they can hear.
Great. All righty, thank you.
And then again, as Jonathan mentioned, we've got our great team and staff with us today. I also want to recognize Jeanette Sawyer in the back, who just makes everything work. Thank you, Jeanette, for putting all this together and all your administrative support. And everyone else, our interns, our great senior team, our legal team. Thank you all for being a part of this.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Let's dive in.
Let's go. So we'll move to the presentation. We may want to move out of the way a little, or I can.
So again, for those on the
I
phone,
think you guys are good.
please pull up the EMAC PowerPoint. And we're on the
So we're
first
going
slide.
to now recap the May 7th election
Right.
and lessons learned.
All right, so let's first take a look at a little bit of the data that Chris and the Secretary were talking about. First of all, thank you, Chris and Secretary Benson, for having us here today. 15% of the eligible voters voted in the May 7th election. That's not too surprising. These special elections, May elections, especially in an odd year, tend to have a lower turnout. But 49% of those people who voted at home or in a clerk's office. Generally, we're looking at about 25%. I have been told that it's a little higher in these special May elections. The school districts do a good job of getting the absent voter turnout up a little bit. So I'm not sure that this would really correlate completely to next year. But for the first time out, I think this is a pretty significant number that we're all going to have to pay attention to. In the 0 to 14 day period, there were 703 registrations processed. 441 of those occurred on election day. So this tells us that people who are waiting until the end are really waiting until the end and showing up on election day. And this makes sense to me. If I'm going to wait, I probably am only going to show up on election day. And of those 703 registrations, 568 of them, or 81%, were first-time Michigan registrants. So that's 568 people showed up during that period to vote that had never voted in Michigan before. We have new registrations broken down by age. The 18 and 19-year-old group, there were 323 registrants in that 0 to 14 day period. So those of you who live or are clerks in a college town, get ready. We even had people in the 80 to, we had 2 people in the 80 to 89 age group.
Better late than never.
New registrants.
New voters.
Yep, new voters. Of the 703 registrants, 68% of them voted in the precinct on election day, which was surprising to me. I thought most people would register and just get a ballot at the clerk's office and vote. I found that interesting. 29% of them voted by absentee ballot either in the clerk's office or at home. And 3% did not cast a ballot, which is interesting. However, you can register to vote in that 0 to 14 day period, but if you don't have residency verification, then your registration isn't valid until the next election. That may be what happened here. But that's 21 people that registered and didn't cast a ballot.
So Lori, I would just like to add, if you go back to that previous slide, so only 21 voters did not vote on election day, maybe because they voted their absentee ballot in a previous jurisdiction, which that is their choice. But of the remaining, 100% of them, of the remaining that, said that right when they came into the clerk's office, I don't want to vote, the remainder, 100% of them voted. So I think that was an important distinction when we were looking at the data.
Thank you. Of the 440 people who registered on election day, 73% of them voted in the precinct. So again, the clerk's office may be in the same building as the precinct. So they registered and just walked across the hall. A lot of people want to watch their ballot go in the tabulator. We know there are a lot of misconceptions out there about AV ballots or vote at home, that people think they don't get counted unless the election is close. People think, that they don't even get counted then. So that may be why 73% of them voted in the precinct. 26% voted by absentee ballot. This says either in the clerk's office or at home, but that's not correct, because if you register to vote on election day, it would be in the clerk's office. You don't have the option to go home. And 1% or 5 people did not cast a ballot. And I have a question, Terry, could this also be voter history didn't get uploaded by the local clerk?
No, Barbara, we were just looking at the raw numbers, and these are people that came that said, I don't wish to participate in this election, maybe because they voted AV in their previous jurisdiction.
Okay, so this wouldn't include if the voter history didn't get uploaded?
No.
Okay. Of the 568 new Michigan registrants, 70% of them voted in the precinct on election day. 30% voted by absentee ballot, and that could have been either in the clerk's office or at home. And 2% or 12 people did not cast a ballot. So these were brand new people to Michigan and registered to vote and where they voted. So if you look at all of these numbers on a graph, these different kinds of registrants in this 0 to 14 day period, you can see that the percentages for each type are fairly close. Around 70% voted in the precinct, around 30% voted at home or in the clerk's office. It didn't matter what kind of new registrant they were, the percentages are pretty much the same. Yes, sir.
Is there a way to break the data out to account for single precinct jurisdictions or jurisdictions where the precinct is in City Hall or Township Hall, where the voter just walks from the counter to the other side of the room and votes, so we can get a better handle on removing that data, how many are truly getting back in their vehicle and going somewhere as opposed to voting in the clerk's office?
Single precincts, yes. Physical location, we don't have anything currently in the database that would help us with that.
Right.
But a single precinct is...
Which is a pretty good...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would also be curious if what those 18 to 21-year-olds, if that represents a larger majority of choosing to go back to the precinct.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Are the in-precinct voters the younger age demographic?
Far and away, the 18 to 20-year-old range accounted for at least 50%.
Going back to the precinct.
Oh, going back to the precinct.
Yeah, she would like to know, can we break it out by how many of them voted in the precinct and how many of them voted with an AV ballot?
Jackie, do you want 18 to 20 or 21-year-old?
18 to 21. I mean,
college age?
Yeah.
Yep. I can definitely do that, and we'll communicate it out.
Thank you. One thing that's sort of special about these May elections and school district elections, we have what we call opt-out jurisdictions. So when a school district in particular crosses city or township lines, it is possible for one clerk to run the election day election, and they're the opt-in clerk, and then the surrounding jurisdictions, we call those the opt-out clerks. And in the past, if you can help me out here, Chris, the opt-in clerk basically did everything.
Right. But now under Proposal 3 and the legislation that was enacted, the requirements for the home clerk of the voters to be open that weekend for the 8 hours, and then the 13 hours on election day for the in-person registration is required. So we took most of the other communities that were in the Lansing School District. However, you know, they still had to maintain those hours for the possibility of those 2 time periods.
So of the 112 opt-out jurisdictions in this May election, 107 of them processed no voter registrations during those weekend hours or on election day. So that was 107 jurisdictions that had to be open for some combination of 8 hours on the weekend and all day on election day. I don't know how many of them processed voters, AV voters. Zero.
I had 0.
Mary had 0.
Saturday, Monday, and Tuesday I had 0.
0. And then 5 jurisdictions did process voters, new voter registrations, but it was a total of 6 registrations. So 4 of the communities had 1 person come in and 1 community had 2. And not to say that this is a bad thing to be open, it's just something that needs to be thought about for these opt-out jurisdictions, or whether.
And I did a very aggressive AV campaign with my 450 roughly voters. We were very, very aggressive on that, and I had a very high turnout for a single issue May election, and it was almost all AV. I sent Sally the data.
Do you happen to remember what your percentage was?
I'll have to look for my email to her, but yes, I can.
Okay. So those are some of the statistics that we have gathered and that we have shared in the news updates with the clerk community. But as the secretary and Chris mentioned, what else? What else would you, as a clerk, think you need in order to be able to plan for 2020? Our national experts, what other data have you found to be helpful in order to help clerks plan for elections? And we would like to get your thoughts and inputs. I know Joe has already given us a little bit of what he was thinking. What else would you guys like from us? Chris?
I just want to note that it's interesting to me that 70% went to the precinct, because out of 8 people who voted on election day in the city of Lansing, 7 of them voted absentee, so only 1 chose to go back to the precinct. But one thing that
do you think that's a location thing?
It might be a location thing. You know, once they're already there, you know, we have precincts in 33 different locations, so you know, I think that does make a difference, and several of them are several miles away. But one thing that we did that I think was really helpful too is we made a modification to the voter registration form, and I can share copies if folks want it. We put an area that says voting options, and then we have a checkbox where they can say, I will vote in the precinct, or I will vote an absentee ballot here. And even gives them an opportunity to sign up for permanent absent voter status, so we didn't have to have a separate application for them.
We have a question from Detroit on the phone.
Go ahead, Janice.
Hi, thank you. So for us, we want really that you all kind of push some kind of legislation that we can process our absentee ballots early. And because we've been talking about it, instead of using poll workers, if we use our staff and then have them sign some kind of gag order or something, could that be a compromise in allowing us to start early? Now, when we say early, we mean like if we could even do Friday before election and then that weekend, and
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's an issue. So I think we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that in a little bit more depth later in
Yeah.
the program, but we'll definitely note
it's
that.
a
well, we're going to be gone at 12:30.
Okay. Well, and if we don't overlap, we can set up a meeting and just dig into this with your team.
Okay.
But it's a high priority for us to figure out as well. So we stand with you in wanting to get a solution here.
And then if you all, in standing with us, would consider that that option that if we use our staff
Yeah.
and have them sign the gag order.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I think what we're looking at is some type of security protection, as you mentioned, and if those security protections are met, then, you know, you can move forward. But we'll I think, talk in more detail later today, and if we miss you, we'll schedule a meeting this week or next and kind of work
Okay,
towards
thanks.
a solution here. Thanks.
Thanks, Janice. Sharon?
So, in addition to age variation, I think it would be helpful not just to have aggregate data, but to think about other variations like size, right? So does a very large jurisdiction, does the breakdown for something like this goes back to, you know, whether you maybe had a different experience, does the breakdown for these different conclusions vary based on the specific demographics, whether that's single precinct, whether that's age, whether that's, you know, the very large jurisdictions, you know. So I think that will help clerks who may not actually match up with if you look at the whole state. The second thing is I'm very interested in how turnout changed based on permanent absentee status in May, and how that recruitment effort that clerks are already doing almost across the state to get folks on the permanent absentee list, how is that influencing turnout? And the last thing is, I think in terms of voters who leave and go vote at the precinct, let's ask them. Let's do a survey of those folks who did it in May in a variety of jurisdictions, a variety of ages, and try and figure out why they did that. That would be one way to get the answer sooner than waiting for another election.
Who would be would that be a bureau?
I think so, yeah.
Well,
Or
Tara, what do you think?
maybe public
Keep
engagement.
looking down.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, in terms of collecting, I mean, we have to figure out a survey instrument of some kind.
Yeah, just talking to the people who participated in voted in this way and kind of figure out and gather some of that data.
As far as the permanent AV, I think we
Yeah.
can be monitoring trends easily enough. I was just talking about that this morning, because I imagine the trend is going up. In terms of AV activity, we should be monitoring those trends, breaking it down by age, demographics, and the like. So I think we can do all of that.
And you've done that in the past. I know that there were various breakdowns in the primary, or in the general election specifically. And Tim he had some data that he would do.
And part of the reason I'm asking that question is I wonder whether younger voters are sort of put off by the extra paperwork of the absentee process. Maybe not, because maybe they're not even getting presented with it by the time they choose to go to the precinct. But maybe, you know, AV has more forms, it has more warnings on it. Maybe there's something about that process that they're less interested in, but we won't know unless we ask them.
Right. Justin?
Yeah, kind of to Sharon's point about the data from the permanent list. So we pulled some of that data from the May election in Ottawa. Particularly interested in it because we had two sort of mid-sized jurisdictions that noticed all of their voters and basically offered them the option of the permanent list. And out of those two, they basically both doubled their permanent list. Probably, and there's a bunch of stats and kind of the way that we broke it down, but basically one of the most interesting pieces was we had one ballot issue that covered two jurisdictions. One of the jurisdictions had noticed all of their voters and doubled their permanent list. The other jurisdiction did nothing. And they're both roughly the same size municipalities. So in the overall voter turnout in the jurisdiction that noticed was 27.2%. The overall voter turnout in the jurisdiction that did not notice their voters was 9.7%.
There you go.
So that was interesting.
Great sample.
Overall, they increased, the two jurisdictions that did notice increased absentee turnout by 21%.
Were they actively looking for permanent AV voters? Were they sending them
They
the
literally
form?
mailed a notice to all the registered voters
Okay.
saying, hey, you should sign up. And what's interesting is those are still trickling in. So after the May election, they've received probably a couple hundred forms, I think. You know, so that's kind of an ongoing process. But I think that shows us that, you know, both the turnout increase as well as, you know, clearly the AV increase. And it was interesting, it was only 27% increase in AVs, but it was also a small election that didn't, you know, that a lot of people sometimes don't participate because of the one single issue.
Okay. Mary?
I have mine. So, of my registered voters, not active voters, my registered voters, I had a 29.75% participation in the May election. Of my registered voters, 25.12% of them voted AV. So 29% participated, 25%, so almost all of mine voted AV. But again, I did an aggressive, we noticed them, included the form. Do you want to be, you can be permanent, or you can have an AV without being permanent. And we had previously done a 19,000 piece mailing to all of my registered that weren't at that time on permanent AV. We've had a 50% increase, and they are still coming. Every day I get 2 or 3 or 5. You know, some amount of them are still coming in.
Mary, have you done an age breakdown analysis on?
I haven't.
What I'd be curious to know. How many were first-time registrants?
That I don't.
Whitney?
Well, I'm really interested in what Jesse just reported, which is that a touch increases turnout. And I think that one of the things that you've got this opportunity to do, because there's so much going on, and we know that it takes four touches for it to sink in, that this is an opportunity for some help with a coordinated campaign, so that there's some language and sample material coming out of a task force or the Secretary of State's office or the Board of Elections. I'm not sure what the right level is, but that it sort of does the work of putting together some good messaging so that there's consistency, so that someone in one little township doesn't get a different mailer than someone in a different township. I mean, there might be some differences based on, you know, having the specifics, but that the overall message looks very consistent. And I think that's really important, that there's not branding, it's a new day for elections in Michigan, but some sort of branding so that all of these continued notices about the different things that are happening, if you pile them up and save them, you could see that they all came from the same place, even though they in fact come from 1,601 places.
Do they have to come from 1,600 places? Can't they just come from us?
They could come from you, but
Potentially.
I mean,
What if we got a foundation grant to cover?
Yeah.
And then we can, I mean, we'd have to sort of figure out what the cost would be, but if we got a grant to cover the communication to every
I
voter.
think even if it came from individual places, if it looked like it came from the same place, that's
Yeah.
maybe almost as good. I've been talking to a couple of you about Future of California Elections, which had a big superstructure in many years, but at its core, it was a series of task forces on designing materials and designing communications for voter outreach that brought together the election officials and all of the advocacy groups, because you guys have one kind of reach, right, which is the official reach, but all the community groups and all the advocacy groups have a second kind of reach, which is down in the community as a trusted neighbor, and to be able to make sure that not just all the official information is the same, but that the information coming out of the community groups actually also looks the same, so that people, you know, as they pick up their little berry basket of information, they can see that they're getting accurate information at all levels. And I think particularly helping the tiny grassroots group and the tiny jurisdictions be as good at communication as the biggest jurisdiction.
So one of our concerns too with the jurisdictions that we're noticing is wonderful, but I almost worry that it's an access problem when you have one jurisdiction that's offering it. And it's not maybe illegally. So the notice is simply a mailing that says, hey, by the way, the law has changed in Michigan. You can now vote absentee or vote by mail without a reason. Would you like to join the permanent list of absentee voters? And that's a great offering to the voters, but the problem is these people are neighbors with people who live across the street in a different jurisdiction that doesn't notice. And so to me, that almost poses a whole, if not a legal problem, it certainly is a perception issue of why are our voters not. So I totally agree. If we can somehow partner with a community foundation or some sort of method of reaching all of them.
Speaking to a group of foundations in the morning, or Thursday morning. So having data like this that I can present and say, look,
Sure.
this is something, and you know, we could, the funding can come through a local group, we can kind of figure out the details, but I think, and Whitney, your point is right, in that let's figure out the right voice and the right voices, but some way to make sure the messaging is effective, but I just am concerned, as Justin pointed out, about the equal messaging and making sure everyone gets the message if it has been shown through data to have such an impact.
County clerks have deep pockets.
Well, my hope is that if we can alleviate some of the implementation costs.
Yeah, very deep
You-
Well, Oakland County can fund it for everyone.
Yeah. Joe?
Statistically, kind of what else, I'm curious to know, now that we have this 0 to 14 data and election day data, what did provisional ballots look like for May? How many folks still had to be issued a provisional ballot? And really, we're kind of gonna need that data, you know, August and November, so we can gauge going forward, you know, is this still going to be something that we're seeing a lot of in precincts, or is it really going to be something that, you know, when we train these election workers, you know, they start to glaze over after so many hours. So if the focus isn't going to be on provisional ballots because there isn't just that many being issued anymore, we can divert our focus to other things. And so I'd be curious to know what that looks like.
Okay.
Good point.
I'm not sure whether Nick, Chris, or Elizabeth was first.
Go
I
ahead,
think it's
Nick.
Nick.
Yeah.
When we talk, going back to the notice issue, when we're talking about the notice issue, you're still essentially saying sign up to be sent an application as opposed to the actual ballot.
Yes.
You can't automatically send the ballot, I believe.
Could we send the application?
You can send the application on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But you can't send the ballots
Right,
unless they
right.
send back the application.
If they're on the permanent AV
Right.
list.
So it's still a two-step process, which I
Yeah.
think is a little problematic.
But we
it's
need
livable.
legislative change.
Yeah, it's a positive change. In terms of trying to do this statewide, which would be great, if you could do a statewide notice rather than having to go through each of the jurisdictions, you're still gonna have a mechanism for the response to go back to the local, aren't
You
you?
gotta know where to
Because
go, yes.
otherwise they won't know to send that
Yeah.
application unless there's some way to
That's a good
code
point.
the qualified voter file. If there was some way to code the qualified voter file so that the clerks knew to automatically send it, and again, I think you got a technology group working on some of this stuff as well, so that may be something we'd look at. Because it would really be nice for individuals, and it would deal with that equal cross jurisdiction lines. If the Secretary of State could tell you, boom, you can get your application automatically sent to you each year, code it on the qualified voter file, tell the clerks that, and they just automatically
Yeah.
pull that list out. That would treat everybody really equally. I just don't know whether or not the technological ability
Yeah.
is there or not.
That's a good point.
On the notice thing, this is a stream that's already pretty far down. For example, I have a mailing that is at a mail house for 60,000 pieces that's going out in the next several days. So, you know, doing a statewide thing, I think definitely has some benefits. One of the things I think we need to think about, and Nick kind of touched on this, I've stopped talking to voters about a permanent absentee list because then they think that they should always get a ballot, and we can't. So I came up with automatic application list.
Yes.
So that's the terminology I've started using, so that's what I have in this mailer, and that's, you know, even though in election community we call it permanent AV list, I've stopped using that term in front of voters as much as I can, although I have to admit sometimes I slip. But one thing that, in terms of doing a statewide mailing that I think would be needed and beneficial is that not all clerks, there's no requirement to send an application to that permanent AV list. And I don't know if that's something that administratively the Bureau can make some interpretation of a requirement. You know, I know even clerks that I know and respect have said to me, oh, well, if it's a May election, I don't send out applications to my permanent list, which I think is wrong, because you've set that expectation on the voter. If you have it, you need to use it for every election, even if you think it's a small election. So I think we need to figure out how to make that expectation that if you have one, it's for every election, and if you don't have one, you need to have one.
Right.
I think there is a bureau thing from years ago
Yeah.
that says if you have it, you do it for everything or nothing. And as a result, some of my jurisdictions do not maintain a permanent AV list because of a bureau edict from, which makes sense. You either
Yes.
do it for everyone or you don't. But some of mine don't have a permanent AV list, which this state mailing may cause an issue with.
Well, and don't forget, going into 2020, voters are going to get inundated with applications. They're going to come from the parties
Right.
and all kinds of,
It's such a good preventative measure when you think about it, because, the confusion, like Whitney is saying, of the different looking mail pieces coming in, and clerks are gonna get inundated anyway.
Yeah.
But wouldn't we rather head it off with an official notice from the election official?
Also, if you do it early, you can actually move the timing, which we've seen, right? That you can actually move
Right.
that timing out of the busiest periods and
Exactly.
time it in places when you have time to handle it.
Yeah, Elizabeth?
I just want to say, really just came up, is we need a public education campaign on what the permanent AV list is. Many of my voters do not understand the ballot will not be automatically mailed to them. They do believe that when you say permanent AV list, that ballot's just going to show up. So we do need public education on that point. Also, I found it interesting in Livingston County on election day, of the 25 voters who registered at the clerk's office that day, all 25 of them did vote right there in the clerk's office, so no one went to the precinct. Following that, I thought it's an interesting statistic for Livingston County. And I think we have to be careful of, not all of my clerks have the permanent AV mailing list. So we have to be careful not to make it an unfunded mandate to maintain one. And there is a cost to mailing out those applications. Just be cognizant of that as we move forward with these decisions.
I think your public education piece is exactly one of the reasons why Chris's automatic application list terminology is a really
Great
good
idea.
improvement, yes.
Yeah, great idea.
So just sorry, a quick reminder, if you, please try to project into your microphone. I've gotten some reports that people are having trouble hearing. So we have Sharon and then Mary, I think,
Mary,
who had questions about the data. And then I think, Lori, you have some more slides to get through, right? So,
Yes.
Yeah.
So just one more thing, those individuals who do not have proof of residency, I would like to know what they had or what they didn't have. Again, that might be a very small sample, but as we're looking, forward to March and November, anybody who shows up and wants to participate and register anytime and can't, I think we really need to understand why and what happened.
I just wanted to note that MAMC's legislative priorities, which is the Michigan Association of Municipal Clerks, is one of our top priorities, continues to be that a permanent, I like Chris's language better, but a permanent AV list is mandated, not optional. And that therefore, because right now, if I have one, they move to Chris, they get kicked off and don't know they're dropped off because they went to another jurisdiction.
Exactly.
So that it would stick with the voter, it's mandated and it sticks with the voter.
I also want to see if there's any protection.
Okay, I'm going to move through the next few slides rather quickly because this group here knows the answers to the questions I'm going to show you, but I'm going to show you the top 5 questions we got from clerks during this May election about this, about some of the changes.
It's gonna be fun, drum roll.
So the top question is, can a voter register on election day and vote in that day's election? Which is yes.
How many?
I don't know that we know how many people asked, but these are the top.
So more than one though?
You know, I will tell you, it was really more of they wanted the reassurance. Like, they knew they could, but can I really do this? Like, it's really a reassurance question.
Yep, what is a big change?
And I think most
It's
of
just a
these
big
were
change.
reassurance questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
The voter's already registered to vote somewhere else, can he or she register here? Yes. It's the point, yes. I've entered the voter into QVF, now what do I do? So, you know, technical questions come up every election, it's not unusual. And this is a big change, and I think I mentioned it last time we came together, we now have Magic QVF, which, you know, has built a lot of these processes and procedures right into QVF to help clerks along. How do I print the receipt? Same thing, you know, just how does QVF work now? Because these were changes that were made fairly close to the election. And how do I process a ballot as challenged? And I know this is going to be a big issue, and I think we're going to talk about it a little later, about that's one of the issues that's come up with the 0 to 14 day registration, and we'll talk about that a little later in the day. So planning, that's it on the May election, but planning for August and beyond, there's just a couple of topics we wanted to touch on, let you know what's coming down the road. The first one is our participation in ERIC, and to give you an update on that, I'm going to turn it over to Terry.
Okay, so with the ERIC program, we're meeting with them on a regular basis. We're basically looking at the reports that they can produce for us. Is it on? We're going to start with the deceased report and their recommendation. That should be the smallest report that we get from them. They go against the Social Security Death Index, as do we, through the driver file. So we're hoping that through that process we'll catch some what we call stale records, older records that didn't accurately get updated a while ago. So we're going to start there and move through the rest of the reports. I believe 3 of the 4 reports we'll be able to handle right at the Bureau of Elections. Another one of the reports is the out-of-state report. We currently handle that process, so it would be something where we would weave it into our current process where we would send out the notices. We currently do that on a monthly basis. And then we also get the returns on that as well, and we mark the QVF accordingly. So I envision that would be the same. We would just weave it into our monthly process. Some of the voters that moved across state, that'll be interesting, getting that report back, and that may be something that we would have to push down to the locals.
Terry, I'm sorry, could you try to pull your microphone a little closer?
Yeah, sure. Is it on?
No.
It doesn't play in the room, it's for the,
Oh,
It's
okay,
good.
you can hear me.
So that's good, she's got to pick it up through there. Oh, I see.
And then one of the other reports, which is probably going to be our largest mailing, is the eligible but unregistered. Right now, that is going to be a very large mailing, we believe, of all of the reports. We sort of have started with the design of the postcard, so it's going to wind up going to all voters who, again, would be eligible. And so that we envision would be a very large number. Erica at ERIC has sent us some numbers on predictions of what those numbers would be. But again, it's kind of hard to completely know until we go through the process. So we continue to work through the process. We first started with very large tests, basically the entire voter registration system, the entire driver file, their database system, and we passed those over to ERIC. And we look to make sure are there going to be any data inconsistencies with those files, because we just want to make sure this winds up being a clean and smooth process. So that's what we're doing right now. We're working with those files just to make sure if there's any issues with the data that we get that corrected first before we start with the various reports. So we're anxious to get started, and that's where we're at right now.
So is everybody clear what ERIC is? everybody has a good idea. So this is a private, nonprofit organization run by member states, and I believe there's 20-some now. I don't know.
Almost 30.
Almost 30, okay,
Yeah,
states.
and a couple more potential, I just heard today.
Yeah, so it's past the tipping point at halfway. And so each of these states submit their voter registration file, their driver's license file, including personal IDs. They use the Social Security National Death List. And so it's really a data sorting that will track people as they move and give the information back. And so that is really reaching a point where for years it's really struggled to reach kind of a critical point with enough voters to make that worthwhile. Now the second piece it does your intrastate moves, so people moving within Michigan. And I know David Becker has brought this up before. This is going to be very interesting because their highest percentage of hits are people in intrastate moves when a new state comes on. And my opinion is those are states that are not really fully implementing motor voter. Now Michigan has implemented motor voter probably better than other than one or two other states. So the question will be is how many voters are we going to find that our motor voter system hasn't picked up? That's going to be interesting, and it might be a little more than we think, but hopefully it's not at the level of states that have not really implemented motor voter. But this is really becoming, and let me say the third piece is our list is a list of people that are on the driver file but are not registered. And essentially they will get notice and an opportunity to register. That's part of the agreement for a state that joins. And it's not free, so this is brought to you by the Secretary of State, this service. And I think it's going to be a leap forward in terms of file maintenance, that we don't have to have all the cards and everything moving around, that this is going to provide on an ongoing basis really good information. We're still trying to get Florida to pull the trigger to actually start because of the number of moves we have of people going south and going to Florida is enormous. So they've agreed, but they're running into some financial issues with their governor. So anyway, that's in a nutshell what Eric does, but it's a huge step forward, and we're looking forward to that coming here, and the data that's going to come is going to be amazing.
Electronic Registration Information Center.
Thank you. Yes.
One of those non-motor voter states is New Hampshire, and there's a push. Actually, I'm gonna talk to the secretary and see if she could give her colleague a little push in understanding, because they can't use cross-check anymore. There is no cross-check.
You're right.
But they are stuck on thinking that they have to have cross-check and that they don't want to become a motor voter state. So that's where some of that data could come from. I mean, they have
Yes.
a little stonewall in the secretary.
Yep, yeah, and
a
there's,
little bit.
yeah, that state's an
And-
interesting state, to
Yes.
say the least.
And we have David Becker, who founded
Right,
Eric.
David's been up
on
to
the
New
phone.
Hampshire.
Yeah.
And still, we're all
Yeah.
kind of trying to make that push across.
Do you have anything to add, David?
I don't have anything to add. Chris outlined it perfectly.
All right.
One of the things that is, I think this is great, and I think that as we move into 2020 and election security is becoming, another big focal point, and now that voting has become easier in our state, the naysayers will start talking about fraud. I really would like to see maybe the secretary, if possible, do like op-eds, radio PSAs, television commercials, getting the message out that we link with the Social Security Death Index. We're part of ERIC, that, because, I mean, when my own parents tell me about dead people voting, I'm like, oh, geez, really? And so I have to explain to my parents how this process works. It
Yeah.
might be good to get the message out that, you know, we're just not sitting back doing nothing, like I think there may be this perception amongst a certain subsector of the population in our state, that we are doing these things with Eric and the death index. County clerks send out death records to other county clerks for out-county deaths, and we do a lot of this coordinating. So I think that would be a good idea as we roll into 2020 to just get the message out on election security in Michigan. These are the things we're doing.
Yeah, our election security task force, where there's some overlap in terms of membership, is meeting next week. So we'll bring that up as well. I think voter confidence is key to making all this work. But so it's a great suggestion. I also think maybe having just a central location on our website, like MichiganElectionSecurity.com or something, where people can go and have these questions answered, and just sort of highlight, even through videos on there of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And then you all can send that out.
Yeah, you can give my parents that web address.
Yeah. Okay.
Sharon?
I'm curious if you would share what Eric's estimates were, understanding that they were early estimates.
Yeah, I don't have them right in front of me, but they're basing it, I think, based on the previous other states and the percentage rates for the various reports. That's where she's getting the information. If you want, I can send it to you. Yeah.
Be interesting to know if you're higher or lower when it really happens, because, for instance, you do automatic address updates already and have been,
Right.
so that's a huge body of the updates in other states.
I will say, when we took over the out-of-state notices in, I believe it was 2012, but we actually started mailing in 2013. That program has been, took over some statistics on that. And that's been a very successful program in identifying voters who really did move out of state based on their confirmation back to us. So I believe there was easily about 33% of those voters did confirm that they lived out of state. Early on, we really captured some statistics on that. So I envision that the ERIC part for the out of state would go along the same lines.
Okay, thank you, Terry. We also will be having more town hall meetings for clerks and continued training, and I'm going to ask Ginny to sort of touch on that.
So April 1st, we released a 45-minute online course on the changes for Proposal 18.3, and we had, as of today, we've had almost 2,100 of our election officials complete that course, which is pretty good as far as our online course completion goes. We've been presenting at county clerk conferences, conferences, but also their local clerk associations. So a lot of the counties have an association within their county with all their local clerks. We've done almost 9 counties now. We've got at least we've either completed 9 or have a few scheduled, and we've attended at least 3 conferences, with more coming up here in the next couple of weeks. That's touched about 700 of our election officials. 8 regional training town halls, we called them. We asked them to take the online course prior to attending, and then if you still have questions, come and see us. It was an optional opportunity, and then we had about 400 people attend those in May. We have 8 more scheduled in the next month and a half for the August election.
Those are based sort of in the areas where they're going to be
so
August
we've placed all the
elections.
regions in areas where, we have the most elections in August and May, and that seemed to help get those that are in an election mindset going, because of course we know there's plenty of election officials that do not have an election this year. Or maybe they will have one in November, and they're really not checked in yet to this process. So they've been well attended. Of course, we continue to communicate in every news update, all different changes, different tweaks to the process, and we'll be weaving all of this into our 2020 training programs as we do.
Sharon?
No.
Okay. We can just leave it off, that's okay.
So we would be interested in any suggestions that you all may have, what else we should be doing moving forward through this year to plan for August and further, and what we should be doing to communicate to clerks, or what kind of training, anything that you think that maybe we haven't done enough of, or something new we haven't thought of. We're open to your suggestions if you guys have any ideas.
So I think the shift you're gonna see is, you know, a lot of rural jurisdictions and suburban jurisdictions in May. And so now you're moving towards city elections, right, municipal elections. And so these are gonna be a little different in nature. Still generally lower turnout elections, but will be an opportunity to see, you know, where the automatic lists are used, and so a whole different set of needs and data are gonna come out of those.
I think it would be great to hone in on who's not participated in each one, just which jurisdictions have not been represented. And with that, on both the online, the town halls, and the other sessions that you've done, just so we can get a sense of who we still need to reach and find compelling ways to reach them.
Whitney, did you have a question? So, sorry, before you go, I just want to say, for the folks on the phone, we're aware that the audio is a little hard to hear. The mics are not connected directly to the phone, so we're going to see what we can do at the break. But I would just ask for folks who are on that side of the room, i.e. farther from the phone, please try to project as much as possible so they can at least hopefully pick you up through the phone. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Whitney.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, it's a really impressive program that you got. I think one of the things, lessons that I heard was when I looked at your 5 top questions, and I think the statement that people were looking for reassurance that they were doing it right as much as anything else means that probably starting in December, January, you probably need some real, like, you know, yes, we've got this sort of messaging to help sort of build confidence and make sure that people who haven't been involved in elections this year are getting the benefit of all the lessons learned of those who were.
That is a great idea, thank you.
I will say, technically speaking, I don't feel that, technically speaking, I didn't feel like we had very many questions at all. And so that's a good indicator too. If our help desk gets a ton of calls on this very issue, how do I, register them within that 14-day period, then usually you're off base in some way. But I didn't feel like we got very many calls at all.
Oh, that's great.
Interesting. Jackie?
I was just gonna share that some of the smaller towns maybe just don't know, we, within Washtenaw County, downloaded all of the email addresses and just did a mail merge, so when, for some communities that resources are limited, there's other ways to reach voters. We had over 9,000 emails of people who weren't registered, or permanent AV. And so without any cost, we were able to connect with those people. But I think maybe some communities aren't aware of, maybe if that's something the Bureau could do, like how to do that. And
where
then,
are you picking up your emails, addresses?
well, that may be unique to us, but the students always provide us an email. So
That's pretty typical.
Yeah,
And that's
young
actually-
people are willing to do that.
And on that point, I think maybe that's something that the state could help with, is collecting the email addresses where people are assured that they're going to be used for official voting purposes, not that you're going to the extent that we can prevent it, get on email lists that people don't want to be put on.
Yeah, it's a nice piece of legislation.
From the DMV?
We don't have a direct connection. That's one of the issues that I will talk about in depth in the AVR presentation. But I think over the long term, that is something we really want to improve, is that connection.
It's on the voter registration form.
It is on a voter registration form. Yeah.
More so than phone number.
Yeah, and so, right, so unfortunately, we'll get into this later. We do have a means of, we transfer voter registration electronically, and we capture email addresses at the branches, but we are not currently transferring those electronically, so that would be good to do, and we want to do that. Mary, I think.
Well, I just want to point out, it would be helpful as a clerk if the state would take optional off of the form for email and phone, because if we have issues even close to the end of the election and I'm missing a signature, I go back to the application because it's too late to send them a letter. I'm trying to call them. I've cold called people because it's blank, because it says optional. Just take the word optional off. They're still going to put it in if they want or not, but Optional makes it way too much of a choice.
And I'm hoping that I'm hoping that Ginny and the forms committee, which I think you are on, if I'm not mistaken, or not, I'm sorry. There has
We
been some
debated
back
that.
there has been some back and forth on
Debated
how to
about it.
phrase the. I was thinking you were on it because we met at your office.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. There has been some back and forth on whether we should say optional or whether we should say something like this will only be used for election purposes. So we will continue to think about that and figure out what the best phrasing is.
So is that not a code change? You don't have to get the legislature approval to put that on a,
I would say no. No.
So why wouldn't you do it then?
Well, part of it is you want to protect it too once it goes on. You know, that's been a reluctance, in other words, to stop it from being FOIA'd and be part of the political list that occur. So that's been some reluctance to push it hard, I think, over the years. But if you took option,
Well, that's what I was gonna say then. Is there a requirement to take something off through code?
So-
Like not allow public?
There's a couple of overlapping issues. So
Yeah.
there's the FOIA issue where we determine that the email address should not be shared in response to a FOIA, but each jurisdiction responds to FOIAs in their own way. So we don't reach out to all of them and say, we can't basically tell them how to respond to all of them. I'm just making sure Mike's not mad at me for anything I'm saying. It doesn't seem like it. The other thing is we also, the other side of the equation with, and if anyone in BOE disagrees, let me know, is we also don't want any clerks to be rejecting an application because they think an email address is required. So part of what we're thinking, the other audience we're thinking about is how the clerks are going to respond to these forms. And so that's not to say it's not a good idea, it's just we're balancing those things.
Okay.
Nick, yeah.
We're getting closer and closer to the one where emails, like phones, phones for, in the early part of the 20th century, you had a phone, now everybody has phones. And we're getting close to the point that everybody has emails, but we still have an awful lot of people who don't have or use emails, so we gotta be careful not to discriminate and rely exclusively on email, I think.
It's just an opportunity to just do additional
Yeah.
outreach where we can.
Right, and I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't be used, it's just that it's not all inclusive, and we have to be conscious of that. We also have to be conscious of the fact, and Jonathan raised it, was my concern was if you take the word optional off, whether or not you're going to have some clerks or some voter officials thinking that if you don't have an email address or you don't provide it, that there's some problem with the validity of the registration, telephone numbers, emails, et cetera, et cetera. So you have the FOIA problem. I think the FOIA problem is probably something we can handle administratively. You might need to go to legislation on it. I think the issue of trying to encourage people to give us email addresses and phone numbers is just a matter of trying to come up with the right phrase. Optional is probably not the right phrase, I agree, but not required or something. You can play with that a while on the forms thing, because you want to make it clear that it's only going to be used for election purposes, and you don't have to give it if you don't want to. You'll still be registered. But we really would like you to give it to us so we can tell you what's going on for your benefit, not
We have some
only
wording
for
that's
us.
tested really well, that removes the word optional, but also adds an if, so that it sort of contains how it will be used, and it's worked pretty well on the voter registration form in 2 other states.
Mary?
So as we gear up for 2020, like, very truthfully, I'm very well connected and pretty much stay up to date, but I have to tell you, gearing up for this election as a clerk, I just spent yesterday going through all the news you can use because I have an August primary, right? To make sure I hadn't missed anything because they're weekly. For clerks that don't have elections this year in the small jurisdictions where a clerk doesn't just do elections, we're missing the point that they're not tuning into a lot of this right now if they're not having an election. So all the training this year has to be redone really quick after the November election for all those small jurisdictions. The permanent AV mailing list is a great tool, but not every community in the state can afford to do that. So those are cost considerations for local jurisdictions, as well as, prepping for next year is going to be major for everyone and having to redo it all. So the training that's going on now a big amount of jurisdictions aren't tuning into it because they're not ready and they're not having elections this year. When I spoke at a user group meeting for my voting system, talking to clerks about how important the permanent AV list was, they said, why would I ever want to do that? You're increasing my work volume. So the education mentality out there, for some of us in smaller jurisdictions, if they counted AVs early, they would be done well before Election Day. So the message we're sharing has to be consistent but a little bit different because of sizes.
Interesting.
If I can, why is there such a concern?
Just a second. Jackie?
I just actually, following what Mary said, is maybe this is a wish list item, but because of the resource constraints, that if the permanent AV list, and if you're compelling smaller jurisdictions, could it be, or permanent AV application list of once yearly? You know, similar to the move ballots.
Right.
Could you apply, whether it's the February, May, August, but once you apply, you get a ballot for the year.
It's the way it should be.
So that would help tremendously with the
Yeah.
cost.
Yeah, let's see what we can do.
Elizabeth?
I just wanted to touch in on the email address. As a FOIA coordinator for the county, it is very true. What one county is going to redact, another is not going to redact. A perfect example of that is start looking around on county clerk websites here in Michigan at the official candidate listing. Some people put all of the information out. Others try to protect those candidates to some degree and do not include everything, including the address listed for the candidate, along with the phone number and the email address. So it's a good place to look for the inconsistencies, would be look at candidate listings.
Yeah. Interesting. Nick, you had a comment?
Yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the security concerns about early voting. I mean, early counting of absentee voters, in that if all we're doing is feeding the ballot into the optic scanner and not looking at the counter, because that's sealed, I don't think you've got that security concern. The one concern that you do have is in the rare instances, I've lived through some of them, where a candidate has died and you wanted to retrieve your absentee ballot so that you could change it. Once you've stuck it in that machine, you've got a problem.
You're done, yeah.
You can't do it, but when you hold the AV ballots up, so that's why I think you can't go much further than the weekend before. You gotta get past the date at which a party could, for instance, name a replacement candidate for somebody who died. And beyond that, I don't really see that as being a serious.
It's a perception.
And it doesn't seem to me that you have a real security problem as long as the counter remains sealed, because all you're doing is feeding the paper.
Yeah, just to give an anecdote, I would just frame it as feedback I was given was that if you had someone, their ballot counted on Monday, they vote on, before their ballot would be processed on Monday, and entered into, and if they passed away Monday night, you would have a dead person voting in that election.
Yeah, that's.
So I'm just saying, like, that's the level of
It gets-
misperception and.
And in reality, that could happen
Just
by a
saying.
mail-in ballot, that you didn't get notice of it.
That's the feedback and the pushback, and,
Right.
but I think in my feeling also, and I don't want us to, well, and we're trying to explore a way to have a balance based on the size of the jurisdiction, and putting adequate security measures in place, and if a jurisdiction is of a certain size, and as Janice was saying about Detroit, puts security provisions in place, does that then permit them to begin processing ballots earlier, or on a Monday even? So I know we're talking a little bit more about that later, I believe, so I don't know.
Yeah, and
there.
I'm working with some clerks on this, and so we've got some data or information from surrounding states, so we'll
Yeah.
chat about that a little bit too.
Is this the last slide?
Yep, so I'm done with my part, Chris, if you want to do a 5-minute.
Can I just say one more thing about training? We did
Oh.
confirm that 100% of our jurisdictions, someone was trained before the May election. So.
Great.
That's
Of the jurisdictions that had a May election.
Yes,
Right.
of the jurisdictions that had a May
So
election.
That would be
still
really,
have it?
really great if
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah.
wing it.
Yeah.
Well, we're close to the lunch break. At this point, any last thoughts on May 7? or what you'd like to see by way of data collection, now's the opportunity.
Yeah, for August and November.
Yeah.
I would just like to say as an election administrator that we need a good public education drive to educate the public, because our smaller jurisdictions have limited resources, and if we had as many in-person on election day voter registrations for a small May election, the resources are going to be greatly strained with our bigger elections. So yes, it is allowed to do same-day voter registration, but I would encourage us to look to see what do we have to do to get people registered before election day, and not put that strain on the local resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why the automatic voter registration piece in particular is so important. And as we roll that out, I mean, ideally, if we do that right, then there would be no need. There would be just a fail-safe to have the allowance for people to register on election day, because they will hopefully be automatically registered.
And possibly with these foundations that you have touched upon, maybe there can be some resources to help the clerks that are located in college towns to do voter registration drives prior to. Even in high schools, when you look at that 18-year-old, 18, 19-year-old range, is there a way we can get into high schools and do voter registration drives prior to election day to help alleviate that strain on the smaller counties and townships?
Christy, do you want to talk for a minute about what you have been involved in?
I'm Christy Dugan, the voter outreach coordinator for the Bureau of Elections, but my other job is to be one of the trainers, so I wear a couple of hats. But the Department of State has been very successful in the last couple of presidential election cycles. Every even number year of sending out the mobile branch office to each of the 15 public universities in the state. We've seen dramatic increases in voter registration in that format. And then some local clerks have coupled with us in that effort, and organizations on those campuses for the students that want to remain registered to vote at their campus address and so forth. And so there's a huge focus on that to expand that. It's about when we just hit just the 15, it's a 3,000-mile tour of the mobile branch, and so that is quite an effort. I know that down in Rochester Hills, the clerks in that area that service Rochester Adams High School all got together in an absolutely wonderful event to literally have the kids out of class for 10 minutes, fill out their application, bring them to a central location, they see their clerk, talk to them about voting, and then they know those kids are going off to college or something else, maybe outside the community for a while, and then they also sign them up for a permanent application list if it was available. So that was a great model, and I've been working with Sally Marsh and others to try to expand on those models, and so any feedback is certainly accepted.
Okay, thank you. And Christy rotates the tires after each, yeah. So each of the topics for the rest of the day all have a public information component. And so be thinking about that, because near the end of the agenda, there is a section on that. And so your thoughts are going to be very helpful on each one of these in terms of the outreach and how we get to people.
Yeah. And on the young voter component as well, we are going to be rolling out a task force on young citizen, young voter outreach in the months ahead with some pretty robust plans there, all tied up into PR. But also that's where data can be really helpful. So, you know, as like even just, you know, the statistic earlier of the difference of turnout as a result of contacting and providing notice about voting by mail. I mean, that's the type of data that if you can help provide and our Bureau of Elections can provide, that helps us get more funding investment, whether it's state funding or private foundation funding in the public education component. But that's why we've also established this, we're gonna talk about this later, but we actually have a public engagement officer, director now, who is on staff at the department, who's developing some really creative ways to address and educate communities, particularly those who have been historically marginalized.
Okay, well, we're at the lunch hour. So lunch is set up, I assume right out here. And we will gather back here at 1:15, or
Yeah.
gather back here to eat.
There's
but
cupcakes
Yeah.
and sandwiches.
We will.
Also, if you did not request a vegetarian sandwich, please try to leave those for the people who did. And yeah, I think we're gonna try 1:15. So.
1:15.
Where we
Yeah.
can meet.
We'll be back.
Okay, we can get started again.
Yeah, just welcome back, everyone. Hope your elections were good. I'm afraid that my warning about the vegetarian sandwiches might have been so stern that I scared the vegetarians from eating them. So just to clarify, there are still vegetarian sandwiches if anyone needs them. Please eat them. We're going to go now in the afternoon session. We're going to really dive into some specific topic areas so we can have some more fulsome discussions about those things, both things that we've already implemented and things that we're going to. We are going to be asking some members of the committee who have been on our subcommittees on these topics to help us facilitate these conversations. We did have some subcommittee phone calls, which I thought were very helpful. It wasn't my idea to do them. I can't remember if it was Chris or someone else, but they were really great. So we did really have some more in-depth conversations, and we're hoping that as we talk about some of these issues as a group, that some of our subcommittee participants can help facilitate those discussions. But everyone should definitely feel free to weigh in. And the last thing I want to point out is that we do have some specific discussion, problem-solving areas that we want to make sure we get to within those conversations. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing that we can talk about, but we do want to carve out some time to get to all of those points. So without further ado, I think we're going to move to our first topic, which is voter registration within 14 days of the election.
Okay, so we came up with some discussion points, some topics, some issues that have come up during this voter registration period in the 0 to 14 days. Jackie, I don't know if you want to start, if you have some specific ideas or things you want to talk about, and then we can maybe open up the discussion a little bit. And we don't have to be, tied to what's up here on the screen. It was just some things that we thought might be areas we want to touch on.
Okay, in our conference call, back in April, some of the issues, of course, which I feel like a broken record on, the challenge ballot process for, voters who don't have the Michigan driver's license with the correct proof of residency. And, also, we did discuss, communication to poll workers. And because the registration for election day is happening in the clerk's office, that we don't lose voters due to poll worker training, that they understand. So that's a big piece. They're not involved in the registration of voters, but are they properly handling and directing voters who are not on their list back to the clerk's office? So those were some of the discussions we had. And then also, I think that's on the problem solving, was there remains the concern of the small jurisdictions and the consolidated election precincts from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
So one of the things, I know Jackie says she sounds like a broken record, but it's very true, this challenge ballot process. There are a couple of concerns. One, I would just like to start with, these machines don't like stickers on ballots or tape on ballots. And in Michigan, the challenge ballot process involves writing the number of the ballot number on the ballot and covering it up with some sort of sticky thing.
Sticky.
And if we're going to have more of these on election day, it's going to cause a problem with the machines. So one thing the Bureau is looking into is invisible ink pens. And instead of writing it in pen or pencil and covering it up, we are.
Need a candle.
Lemon juice when I was a kid.
Lemon juice, yeah. So we've tested a couple of different kinds of pens. They come with a light that you can shine over it and see. We know there will be conspiracy theory concerns. So we've done a lot of testing. We've marked ballots with the ink. The machines don't read it. We've covered up timing marks with the ink. The machines don't see it. We have written on the ballots, I should say Carol Pierce has written on the ballots. Carol has put them in the freezer, Carol's put them in the refrigerator, she's put them on the windowsill, she's put them in a dark room. I believe Joe has participated in some of these experiments with his invisible ink. So we're fairly confident that it will last, that it won't get changed by any kind of elements. I think water made some of them wet to see what would happen. But that leaves us with a perception issue. So I know one of the things that we've talked about is if the poll workers or the clerk in the office is writing the number on the ballot, that it's going to be very important to show with the light. You know, you write the number on the ballot, the voter can't see what you're writing now, or it fades fairly quickly. So it'll be important to shine the light over it to show all you wrote was the ballot number. That's sort of one thing we've been thinking about. I don't know, do you have any thoughts or questions or concerns about that? Do you think this is a good direction for us to be going in? I know.
Well, I think faced with the option of not having voting equipment available for use on election day, because these things get gummed up with labels that aren't put on there completely, and a dog ear gets lifted up while it's being fed in. I think it's a reasonable alternative. We tested it in our office extensively. When you initially write the number, it is visible to the naked eye for about 5 to 7 seconds, and then it fades away. And any possibility of doing anything to that ballot, filling in, trying to make overvotes with it, anything just was not picked up by the high-speed equipment, by regular tabulators, by nothing. So I think that it's a reasonable alternative. Look, in my 13 years, we've never had to go into court to have a ballot container pulled and have a ballot fished out. Well, you've been in this a lot longer than I have.
Never seen it.
You've never seen it either, right? So, I mean, the bottom line is, for something that frankly just isn't ever really put into play, there's no reason to be cutting out slips of paper and taping or labels and all this stuff. Just use that ink pen, write the number on it, and keep it moving. And so, and then, you know, we'll all have a UV light, probably never to be brought into a hotel room, but it'll be just saying, it'll be in our office. You know, if we ever need it, we could have it available.
So, and we are looking at creating kits, that every precinct
Yeah.
would have a kit, we would have a light and a pen, and then the clerk's office would have a
Right.
kit.
And we can imprint on them as well, so we can make it say State of Michigan Challenge Ballot
Sure.
Pen or something along those lines. I think the perception issue is there regardless. When you're writing a number on there and putting a piece of paper over it, I don't think that's any different than an invisible ink writing a number on it. And in my thought process here is, I like the invisible ink as a voter, because when you write that number down and put it on a piece of paper over it, you can still see that number. You turn that ballot around and you can see it even when you've written it on it in pencil.
The other comment I wanted to make was about the comment here about this consolidated school election under this topic, you know, and this issue of how we're gonna work this out in the 14 days, all that good stuff. I mean, the way the statute's written right now, you know, county clerks are supposed to conduct these school elections unless a local clerk opts in. And so, I mean, there were instances when this all started where counties were, or still are maybe in parts of the state, I don't know, still picking up the slack. In other places, it's other clerks in other communities. You know, they're opting out of this, opting out of that. To me, it's either you run elections or you don't. It's a burden on our office to have to get involved sometimes and not all the time. We're not built for that. And so, I mean, maybe this is a legislative change we look at and just say, if local clerks are in the election business, then they're in the election business. And that's just, I mean, probably not a popular comment. I know there's local clerks in the room, but it is what it is. And so that solves this issue, if that's the way we're gonna go. Because the way that that bill is written, it says that their local clerk, their city or township clerk, not a neighboring city or township clerk. So that's gonna require a legislative change too, to get around that. So, we either tackle the school election portion of the statute, or we tackle the portion that deals with who they get their ballot from and who they register to vote with. But either way, one of the two are not in tandem. Even without clerks through these school agreements coordinating with another local clerk, it technically is a county responsibility.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Couple different.
Jackie, I think you're next.
Not to go back, I was gonna say something more about the
Yep.
challenge ballot process, and I know the law is there, but if we're talking about what could be done, I still just personally struggle with why someone who is physically in my office registering to vote, just because we've given them 15 more days, why they're challenged. We would, in pre-proposal 3, you didn't challenge anyone who registered in person. So I just personally, and I know I'm gonna have a lot of these people, they're not going to have Michigan driver's license with a local address. And I just don't understand why there's not pushback on that piece of the law, that why are we even challenging in-person registrations? And so, and I know that's my broken record, but I would, that's a wish list, that we just don't have that process for in-person. Election day, I maybe can understand if there's a concern about how fast we're registering and updating, and did they vote somewhere else, but, they're being entered in QVF on the spot. What does day 16 versus day 14 make a difference?
Do
I
you want to respond to that?
I can tell you the philosophical reason it was done, not whether or not I agree with it or think it's the right thing to do. But I know one of the things is, if you register outside that 15-day period, and you don't have proof of where you live, there's time for an ID card to go and come back theoretically in the mail. But if I register, I'm just telling you what I know. But if I registered 3 or 4 days before the election, there's no time for that ID card to go out and come back. I know that is part of the philosophical reason for having a way to pull these out if necessary, if somebody sues. I'm not advocating or not.
I mean, the only place in the statute that ever comes into play is in court.
Right.
It's in a challenged, contested election. This would be after a recount. And the reason would be is that that person was ineligible to vote in that jurisdiction. That's the idea for the challenge ballot. As close as it ever came to being used was in Ann Arbor. But it really they weren't challenge ballots. They were, I think you had a mayoral, this would have been in the 70s, back when you were younger. May not even been born. And so the judge, they found people, Ann Arbor has all these islands of Ann Arbor Township. And these people were registered in Ann Arbor City. They voted. And so the judge said, you've got to tell me who you voted for, even though it wasn't a challenge ballot, because he thought he could back those out and break the tie. And the Michigan Supreme Court said...
I voted for the person I didn't vote for.
Yeah, the Michigan Supreme Court said, no, that is not something you could ask. So there may even be, if this ever came to be a reality in some election, I think there's a big legal issue even there as to whether, once they got to court and started talking about pulling slips off or getting the magic ring out with a light on it, that whether the court would even allow them to do that. That would be some real, I've never heard it being done in 40 years I was there. And So it's become a sop, if you will, for people. It's like, okay, what makes you feel better? Oh, well, we'll just do these as challenge ballots, and everyone goes, oh, okay. And they feel better, and they move on, and that's it.
If I can, the one case I'm familiar with, which was before both of our time, back in '58, the
Yeah.
congressional election.
Way before my time.
Was decided, I worked for the congressman later on in his tenure, and near the end of his tenure, this was at the beginning of his tenure, where the election was ultimately decided by 7 votes and 5 challenge ballots were involved. I don't know the details, that's how long ago.
Interesting.
But so there are rare instances where there could be some question about the challengeability of a ballot, although I'm not sure that it really makes a whole lot of sense. I think that brings to the bigger question, maybe somebody can bring us up to date, of any challenges or discussion, because that was in the, if I remember correctly, that was in the statutory implementation, not in the constitutional amendment.
That's correct.
The constitutional amendment says it's not supposed to be statutorily implemented. It was. I think there were some challenges brought. I don't know what the status of all of that is. Does anybody know?
So I guess all I would say is that the proposal language says that the voter will receive a regular or an absentee ballot. So I sort of wonder why we keep having this conversation. I don't think that the legislature had the authority to make the ballots challenge. I agree, especially with your point that voters who showed up in person previously did not, without providing any proof, did not get a challenge ballot. I think that we should note, in case we all don't note, that there's a disparate impact for driver's license and personal IDs. There's been studies that were actually at the Civil Rights Commission that both the Secretary and I testified at. There were professors who have released a report that there's a disparate impact to our driver's license, personal IDs, and who has it and who doesn't. So, it's a challenge that it was not it's a challenge ballot which was not provided for under the constitutional language. It's likely to have a disparate impact. I think the state's interest, talking to the lawyers in the room, must be pretty weak if folks can't remember using it in the last 50 years. What is the state's interest? What are they protecting here? Those are my comments.
My specific question, though, is there any pending litigation or questions before the Attorney General?
What I have said is it's ripe.
On this or other issues surrounding that implementation legislation?
I think it's fair to say that it's ripe for litigation.
But there hasn't been.
There is
none's
no
been
lawsuit
brought.
filed at this time.
Have you considered making a request of the Attorney General for an interpretation on any of these questions?
Yeah, I mean, well.
That's cheaper, that's the only reason. I suggested that we could end up in litigation anyway, obviously, as we know, once the Attorney General makes a ruling, but it might be the easier route.
So I think what I'm hearing loud and clear on this topic here is that it's something that maybe the legal staff and the executive staff should have a discussion on, what options we have, what we could do.
Right.
At this point, what position do we want to defend?
Right.
Kind
And
of.
consider consulting with the Attorney General's office.
And I think, Sharon, we can have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah.
Chris, did you?
I just want to argue against the methodology of disappearing ink.
Okay.
I do not want to give that to my election workers. I do not want any voters to know that I have given that to my election workers. I don't want them to think, oh, they might have marked any other ballots that are in the pile. I think it's a dangerous tool, and I don't think it actually meets what's in state law. So if we did do it, it would require legislative change, but I think it's a bad way to go.
Okay. What alternatives do you think?
I think that what we have now is securing over, and yes, it's possible for something to come off, but it's, the number that we have historically we haven't had an issue, even though we have had a few here and there, but I would be very nervous about
What about an
having
option
disappearing ink.
so that you don't have to do it, but if others want to?
It would make me very nervous to know that there are election workers with invisible ink pens.
Because of the perception issue.
Because of the perception issue by the voter, yeah.
Noted.
Just my 2 cents.
Yep.
I would find it very hard to tell someone who's disparately impacted by the photo ID option that someone was marking their ballot with invisible. And I would advise you to not use that. And I'll say that, noted as a lawyer in the room.
The issue is not photo ID, it's proof of residency.
I understand
Oh,
the
okay.
issue. What I'm saying
Yeah.
is, for those residents, speaking as representative of the NAACP, if I'm telling my constituency, oh yeah, they're gonna mark your ballot with invisible ink, they'd be like, excuse me?
Yeah. I get it.
That's
But
not
if-
gonna apply.
If you told them that they were gonna
They don't
record in
care.
regular ink
No.
their serial number that could be traced back to them and potentially be visible, they'd be okay with that?
I would argue that it's not constitutional based on the ballot language having helped to
I mean,
write it,
there's
that they
two
can't
options.
do it. That said, they are used to challengers in the precincts and they're used to the process now. To say that you would mark their ballot with invisible ink, they're gonna be like, no. I mean, they'd much rather be able to see it, be able to track it and know that it had a C on it versus, I mean, you're not changing the fact that they're marking it in the poll book, you're just changing the fact that they can see the C on the ballot.
Well, they'll be able, yeah, they can see their ballot number now on it. They, yeah, the ballot number would be on there now, under current law.
Right.
It'd be visible.
It's not a,
visible in the poll book, are you marking?
No,
it
on that
invisible?
physical ballot right now. we mark
it's,
it.
but
it's
it's
not a
getting
C, it's the
tabulated.
ballot number that's recorded.
Okay.
Yeah.
But, I mean, my point is, they
Right.
know that it's marked as a challenge ballot,
Right.
so you're not hiding anything, you're just
Right.
hiding the fact that it goes in the tabulator, you can pull it.
Your
out.
concern is that they're thinking, what are they really writing on that
Right.
ballot?
Yeah, you've got invisible ink, you can mark anything else, I
Right.
mean,
It's just like an issue of transparency. Okay, I know you're gonna
Right.
track me, but you're
Right.
telling me you're tracking me. other-
And I can see you're
Right.
tracking me.
Yes.
And I can see
Yeah.
you're not marking anything else.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say, the whole idea of it just sounds crazy.
No offense.
But all I have to say is, for those of you who participate in the public working group on security, or are part of the various Twitter attacks, it just, the whole thing just is a Twitter nightmare waiting to happen. Because there's no way that you're ever gonna get past the word invisible ink. I mean, and even though I think it's actually probably a pretty reasonable technical solution to this problem, the real problem is to get rid of tracking people's ballots. Because the notion that we have a secret ballot kind of sort of maybe sometimes, put it in an envelope if you're gonna do that. Right, I mean, make it a provisional, I mean, do it real, and not do this weird kind of, we sort of counted you, sort of happened. But speaking as a total non-lawyer.
Well, we now have a constitutional right to a secret ballot, which interestingly, I don't think you would have found the word secret ballot in Michigan election law ever. It's just sort of been this ongoing assumption. So it may well not only not follow the constitutional language when it comes to getting a regular ballot, it also may run up against the secret ballot.
Because, I mean, the real issue here becomes, then that needs to be the road you go down, is to just eliminate this practice.
Yeah.
Because if you are gonna start challenging all of these ballots, especially in college towns, and you don't have a lot of extra equipment, and you start gumming up the lenses of this optical scan equipment, now what are you gonna do? And so, I mean, it's gonna, if that's what's gonna happen, we're gonna be now introducing more challenge ballots into the process, something that doesn't occur a lot right now. A lot of these folks don't have a lot of extra voting equipment to be hauling out to account for stuff that goes down because of these things coming loose.
I guess the only other thing I would add is that, where folks are going to get the challenge ballot is consolidated in not just college towns, but urban areas. So what is that gonna mean? That is gonna mean that places that have already historically had long lines are going to have long lines because your poll workers are having to process more ballots in college towns and urban areas as challenge ballots. one more reason why I don't think a practical sort of, it's putting an extra challenge on the poll workers that's going to put a strain on that voting system and those locations.
I think we had Nick then Mary. Is that right?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I know people who think that all of the moon landings were simulated and we never land on the moon. So there's going to be a conspiracy theories on anything you do. I find that argument not as compelling on the invisible ink issue, especially if they're watching you write it, see it there, and then see it disappear and put it in. But I think if whether you do use that approach or use the traditional approach, the issue of requiring all of these ballots to be challenged is a serious one. And to use Sharon's term, it is right for a legal opinion on whether or not that portion of the law, the so-called initiating law, the statute that I thought was quite frankly totally unnecessary. The constitutional amendment was supposed to be self-executing. By its own language said it was self-executing. I would have challenged the whole darn thing, quite frankly, but I understand the realities of the world and the practicalities of the world. It seems to me that piece at least is very right for challenging if we can not have to have the danger of gumming up the works, literally, with these pieces of paper, or the conspiratorial arguments that come with invisible ink. All the better. That just helps us avoid one unnecessary problem that those of us who have been around this business a while know a challenge ballot is ballot. I've never seen a challenge ballot thrown. Provisional ballot, envelope ballot is a different thing, and I wouldn't want to go to the envelope ballot directly if we can avoid it, because it ultimately is often not counted, where the challenge ballot is counted. So.
Mary, Julia, Justin, Joe, I think is the order.
I would like to see every aspect of a challenge ballot
Challenged. Not to overuse a word, because under current law, anyone who received an absentee ballot that they did not vote by law can be challenged in the precinct, and I had this happen because I've never trained to it, and I had a big dust up in the presidential about it. You could, because frequently someone who gets an absentee ballot, it didn't arrive. We send them to the precinct to vote because there's not time to make all this stuff happen. Every voter who was received and did not vote and return their absentee ballot can be challenged. And when you get an exuberant challenger like I had, who decided this was their hill they were going to become famous on, it's a problem.
I think
We're off
I think
subject, sorry, but.
I mean, I think what we should do is revisit the reasons for challenges in general, and because I think there's probably a lot that we haven't even touched on that might be antiquated and ready for ripe for removal. So I think we'll go there.
And, you know, we shut down a lot of it over the years, the blanket challenges. We required challengers to have reasons why they're challenging, in terms of, if they don't have something in hand, you can't look at somebody and challenge them, okay? You need to have some reason to believe that person is no longer a resident, or what, you need something. And so when these challengers are pushed that way, they generally will back off. And I think, like in Detroit, the last couple of elections I've been involved in down there wasn't a single challenge ballot in the entire city. We've discouraged challenging without reason. You know, to have a reason, you've got to, that has to be there. You can't just say, oh yeah, we're going to challenge that voter. Which means they've got to do pre-work, they've got to do mailings, they've got to do, and for whatever reason, people don't do that. So, but yes, I think it is right for
We can re-examine.
Yeah, we will. Julia?
Okay, if this question has been answered, I apologize. But my first question is, how many challenged ballots do we have? Just period. I mean, you're talking about that 14 days, and forgive me, but I'm from a much smaller place, and I don't have that many opportunities for a challenge. But how many are we talking about? I mean, for some of the big places, are we talking hundreds? Are we talking thousands? Are we talking 10? You know, and if it's 10, so what?
It's not gonna be 10.
Well, and that's what I guess, like in my case, I mean, I don't think I've had 10 challenge ballots in the 9 years I've been clerk. But again, I don't have the numbers that some of you have.
There were
But then-
50,000 like affidavits in lieu of ID in the 2016 election around there. So all those people, if they had to register, those are all people who didn't have a driver. Well, no, they didn't have photo ID, so it'd actually even be more than that.
This would be,
already on the voter rolls, though.
this was gonna be everybody registering from day 14 on who doesn't have a Michigan driver's license with their local address. Anybody that misses the 15-day registration, for me, could be thousands in
Well, that's why I'm
presidential.
asking. And then the other clarification I want, a challenger versus a challenged ballot, isn't that two different things?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I thought, my brain just started to explode on me there as we shifted subjects, and I'm like, and again, I'm coming from a smaller place. I don't get that many challenges. I get more provisional than I do challenge.
And hopefully
Which-
that will change now too.
Yeah, but it's,
Provisionals are identified too.
Right. Justin and then.
Sorry, I don't mean to belabor the point, but I think one of the things that I constantly am thinking about is we're always, as election administrators, balancing the high priority of voter access with the high priority of voter security. And the process of security heavily relies on perception as well. And I guess I would just ask, what other form of, not to be like the major advocate of challenge ballots here, but what are some things that we can tell voters who are concerned that somebody can walk in on election day without any sort of proof of their residency, sign up and cast a ballot? I think that question needs to be asked, and we need to have an answer for it.
So, just so I'm clear, the constitutional language requires you to provide proof of residency. I am not suggesting that individuals who could not provide proof of residency should be given, frankly, any ballot. But right now, we have a two-tier system where if you have a driver's license, you get a regular ballot, and everybody else, every other form of proof of residency gets a challenge ballot. And that two-tiered system, and to your point, Nick, I know that we all know officially that the challenge ballot goes in the machine, but that is not how it's going to feel to those people when they have an extra, more burdensome process.
I totally agree. I guess I'm just asking the question. So if not a challenge ballot, then what? You know, because I kind of agree. I mean, going the provisional ballot route is certainly
For people who have no,
First option.
wait,
So
what
you
are,
can't.
Right, yeah.
wait, what are you asking? What kind of ballot for whom?
For the people who have proof of residency but not a driver's license, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's what we're asking. If for me, it's gonna
So
be.
you're asking to change that
I
driver's
have
license.
proof of residency, the University of Michigan hands me something, they're a state institution, it says I live in this dorm. Why does that not count for a regular ballot? We're not talking about I have no proof of residency.
And there's legislation that says it doesn't,
Correct.
right? That's.
I think
There's
that's,
That it says it has to be
Challenge.
challenged.
Right.
yes.
And so I.
So what happened was the legislature applied a photo ID requirement on top of the proof of residency. They actually are only giving a regular and absentee ballot to someone who provides an identification that both satisfies photo and residency, but that's not what the
So,
Constitution
yeah,
says.
and so you know the history of this, because you were involved. That they originally wrote, yes, you.
Sorry.
Yes. Because they originally wrote it, the first introduction was,
You expect me to remember
you
lame
remember
duck?
all this. If you didn't have a photo ID of the license, you were done.
That's right.
Period. So then it was expanded as it went through the process, right? To go with the NVRA or the HAVA identification. So another piece of information with, so you've got the ID and you also have, you know, the bill or the check or the university provides the residence piece. And so when they added that, they added the challenge, right? I think that's how that worked.
And these individuals are still susceptible to Michigan's photo ID law. They're still, that's separate, right? Prop 3 didn't
Well,
change
they're voting
that.
absentee, or they're voting by mail. But
Okay, yeah, but we're talking about the registration in person in the 14 days, so they have to come in.
So they'll sign the affidavit
And they'll be
too.
asked for photo IDs under the separate provision.
Oh,
Right?
right. Yeah, so I guess, so really then the request, I was trying to like parse out, so maybe the request that you're talking about, Jackie, is changing that piece of the legislation that passed in lame duck that would require the additional photo ID versus changing, because the conversation
that allows for
was-
challenges if you don't have a photo ID.
Right.
That allows for, I wanna change the requirement that if they have proof of residency, but it happens to not be a Michigan driver's license, that they're challenged.
Right.
I want it.
Yes,
that-
noted.
Right.
We got it.
If, okay.
Yeah.
You can provide a passport or any other kind of ID that's valid.
Well, the
photo
passport
ID.
is the photo ID,
Right.
and if they had
And
a,
then they can provide an alternate residency.
But there's two paths, as I
They've
understand.
met both requirements. by now.
right.
Yeah.
But there's two paths to changing that. One is legislative and one is legal.
Right.
So.
Only one is easy.
Which one is that?
Only one might be possible.
Right.
I would just remind everyone of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution that does require compelling government interest for voters to be treated differently. So they're just. So I think we've
Yeah.
we should keep moving. So I know that, but noted this, you know, I think we've emphasized this.
I just want to say one sentence. The section A of the new constitutional language that says, once registered, a voter has the right to vote a secret ballot in all elections. I wonder if that completely eliminates the legality of having a challenged ballot
Right.
in any
Potentially.
circumstance.
Yeah, I think it does.
I think it eliminates them all.
Oh.
I don't think we have challenged ballots in Michigan anymore under the Constitution because they're no longer secret if they're marked as challenged.
Let's dig into that.
I mean,
Ed,
there's
is
a company
she-
question. I mean, if it's not a challenge ballot, then what is it? So-
Yeah.
Have you completely I mean, we talked about this last meeting, and the statutory language that they passed during lame duck is not totally clear. Have we resolved this registration issue, or are we confident we resolved it, where I'm a first-time registrant, so I'm entitled to register and get a ballot, as opposed to I'm registered someplace else already in Michigan, and now I'm before you registering, but the way the statute's written doesn't really say that I'm entitled to also get a ballot, absentee.
If you've
On
already
election day.
requested
At the
one from
same
your
time.
previous jurisdiction? Or no?
Registration on election day, in the legislation, they limited it to people registering
For the first
and
time.
voting on election day.
Oh, right, and
Right.
then not getting, and you can only get
Well,
an
they just say
absentee ballot.
registering, they don't,
Right.
I'm not sure if they say first time.
It's for the
but then
jurisdiction.
In the jurisdiction.
But yeah, but that's the part I think that
Yeah.
it's not,
But the
Clear.
Constitution
Clear.
says you
Yeah.
can register and vote on election day absentee,
Our-
and there's nothing else
So
that
is that
prohibits you from
resolved?
re-registering at your same address.
Yeah.
even.
So it's possible the legislation conflicts with the Constitution.
it's possible, because the legislation's not clear.
Yeah.
I think our guidance has now been, clear for, since maybe the start. We have, our guidance says anyone can come register
Correct.
in person and then.
And receive it.
receive a ballot. That even if it's a move within your jurisdiction, the legislation appears to us to conflict with what the Constitution
Okay, I
says.
thought that was something that we actually changed in this,
We did in certain ways, so sorry to, I mean, this.
See, you do remember.
We did not add intra-city or townships, intra moves. And one of the things that I think is best probably addressed in a different conversation is, you know, it used to be that you could move inside of a city without going through a full registration process.
You still can.
Well, but then you show up on election day and you got to do the ID. It's kind of a mismatch. And also, what's odd is it seems like it sort of drives you. You don't see. It gets very confusing. Okay, if you want to move inside the city of Detroit, I can go vote at my old place where I do not live anymore without providing any ID. But if I want to go and vote where I am currently living in my new place, I'd have to be subjected to more requirements. So it's kind of, we fixed some of it, not all.
And that's
But-
also,
but-
I think,
But
a
they
point of
have implemented it, that any move, any re-registration, any new registration, they're all treated the same.
That's
Until 2:50.
You would like to do satellite office?
Yeah, can we just, we're a little
Yeah.
kind of, I don't want to cut short the conversation, but I do want to make sure we talk a little bit about satellite offices before we move on to the next topic.
Before you get to that, I just want to really close here with, there are a number, between last meeting and this meeting, we raised a number of questions about the constitutionality of the implementing legislation, dealing with things like, well, what we're talking about now, dealing with liberally construed, dealing with, a whole bunch of things. Has anybody been compiling those questions?
Yeah,
Right.
and this is
Because-
recorded as well.
Because I'd kind of like to see that, because I've raised several of them. I
Yeah.
make sure, not only to make sure we've caught it, if we could all see the compilation of those, so we could get a concise version of the questions that you're going to want to
Right.
have your legal staff and
Clarify.
whomever try to conclude.
Yeah, I
because-
think, well, I mean, the idea is this committee will create a report. And I think out of that report, you can, within that report, some of these questions can be answered with recommendations. This is how you should answer. Some should be open for further consideration. So keep
But
that
even-
in mind as you, this is all to sort of get this out, but in terms of compiling those questions, we do have those notes. And I think I would envision them being a part of the report that comes out of this committee to say these are the,
But Johnson, really what I'm hoping for is before we get to the report.
Understood.
That right now, we
Yep.
see what we've got so far so
Sure.
that we can figure out what we're missing or if we've covered everything.
Right.
Just as a check, so that when you're writing the report, you've got.
Got it.
The data.
okay.
We'll get a list
Understood.
together.
So, there's one more topic I think that's important to cover, here before we move on to the next thing, and that's, satellite offices. Sharon and I spent some time with, the folks in Detroit and with Chris in Lansing to talk about their satellite offices, what they've done to get them up and running, how it works for them, and what I think Sharon would agree that it's actually kind of two separate models. It's two different ways to do it, and Detroit is a very large jurisdiction. It's very, not only is it spread out, but they have so many voters and they have several satellite locations, and their model may not work for everybody. Chris has a model that he's been using in Lansing. I don't know if that might work for everybody. There may be some hybrid, I don't know. But if Chris and maybe Sharon could share some thoughts about satellite offices, how they work, how they've worked for you, where you see that fitting in come next year.
The way we've used it is, it's a semi-permanent location that we staff. It's where we keep all of our election equipment, so it's outside of City Hall. It's about 2.5 miles from City Hall. In Lansing, there's kind of, people see a dividing line of 496 north or south of 496, so City Hall is north of 496. This is south of 496. It's perceived to, serve people on the south end of our city. So for, used to be 30, now with the constitutional language talking about absentee ballots available for 40 days, we decided to go ahead and make sure it was open for 40 days before every election. We're there anyway, to be quite honest, getting the election equipment ready and supplies ready. So for us, it's barely even an additional cost. The voters love it. We have a 24-hour drop box, so I would say almost half of our absentee ballot applications don't get postage on them. They get dropped off at one or two of the locations. Same thing with our absentee ballots. Our voters drive and drop them off in the drop box. And some of the things that you have to consider, you have to make sure that you have a Dymo labeler and a ballot for every precinct, computer, obviously, you know, and you have to figure out what your staffing is gonna be. And what we've tried to do is be very consistent about it. When we're open 8 to 5, except Wednesdays, we're open till 7 o'clock every time. And we almost always end up having training most of those Wednesdays, so again, it's not necessarily additional staff. So it's been pretty low cost and pretty effective for our voters. When we have to do the weekend hours, that's where we do them, is at that location. It's free parking as opposed to our city hall. We've had, in bigger elections, we've had lines, you know, we've had, you know, a couple hundred people on a day or more, so. It's very effective, and you can make it cost efficient, I think, in a lot of circumstances.
Sharon, can you speak to the Detroit model?
Yeah,
or?
I mean, I guess I can't, I voted there. I voted there, and when you talk about those lines, I mean, I actually gave birth shortly before the 2012 election, and I was in one of the satellite locations. There was 100 people waiting, because it was like the last 4 days before the election, and that's the intensity at those Detroit locations. And so Janice will have anywhere between, I think she's had no more than 4, but in those last few days, there will be hundreds and hundreds of people going through those locations. And that was under a system in which, you know, 25% of Detroiters were voting absentee. If we're jumping that up to 50 or maybe even beyond in the city of Detroit, they are just going to deal with such high volume. And the backstory there, and I think Janice had hers before you. Did she start?
I've had 2, Lansing had 2 locations since before I was clerk, actually.
Oh, okay, all right. So
but
for
I
Janice,
moved it.
yeah, for Janice, it was demand. It was that in 2008, the line for absentee voting at her main, you know, clerk's office on West Garden Boulevard was just blocks and blocks and hundreds of people. So she got ahead of that and said, I need to distribute that demand around. And so I think I can't remember what the phrase they used, but, you know, she said you basically look around, how do you have your clerk's office, and then you take all those things to the satellite office. All the ballots, access to the QVF, a secure, you know, mechanism for locking everything up, booths, chairs for people to wait in, sort of all the things that she has in her office to process absentee voters is what goes into these locations. And for them, because they have so many locations and such high demand, they have a whole procedure by which they're tracking what's going on. Are they running out of ballots in a certain location, and they're they're doing a distribution every night if need be, as they get closer and closer. There's actually a runner on her staff who is assigned if they need something in the middle of the day in those last, you know, very busy time, they're delivering it in the middle of the day. So I think the other thing is, you know, satellite locations like Detroit has to run it is not, maybe nobody else in the state will have to do that. But we have talked about, you know, some of these communities that may have really significant election day registration having, you know, another place for some to reduce that demand on election day. So there's going to be some situations in which it makes sense, and there are going to be lots of communities in which it doesn't make sense. But Lori and I are going to write up the notes from those 2 meetings and share it with the clerks for any corrections. I saw Dan Baxter at a meeting yesterday, so I'm going to get some insight from him as well, since he was there when they implemented them, and then we'll share them with everyone.
Yeah, I think what would be helpful is to get a sense of what jurisdictions, you know, is Traverse City one, you know, is Ann Arbor one of them? What jurisdictions would benefit from satellite locations, particularly when it comes to processing the voter registrations and the absentee ballots? And I think there's a separate conversation, which maybe is a different part of this, about the actual voting from home process and voting by mail, and whether there needs to be, in terms of distribution and return of those ballots, alternatives beyond the satellite locations like drop boxes and the like. But I could see, like, you know, East Lansing, Ann Arbor. Yeah, I don't know what other. And I'd sort of just like, it would be helpful for us to just get a sense from you all. Yeah, Grand Rapids, Flint. What jurisdictions would benefit from this, and then we can work to provide resources and support for that.
In any college campus, I mean, we see this in California.
Yeah.
A lot of even small counties that set up satellite offices do it on the college campus, just
Yeah.
because that's a kind of big closed environment full of people who do things at the last minute.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Maybe have one on every college, all the 15 campuses and community colleges as well, and look to that as we develop our plan for it, because we can also work with the student government and officials at the colleges to process those.
I think Amber on the phone, I think, had a related point.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everyone, and sorry for my tardiness. I'm on the West Coast giving a keynote this morning, so I just got done with that. I just wanted to say on the satellite, I mean, there's a lot of experience in various states with vote centers, because that's essentially, that same kind of process. So I think there's certainly a lot of best practices for designing them and lessons to be learned. And I think similarly with and I couldn't hear who was saying it, but with the 50% of vote at home, vote by mail ballots being dropped off at satellite, that's consistent, and frankly, in a lot of the vote at home states, I mean, Colorado saw upwards of 70% being dropped off, which actually makes it more efficient for election officials to process, because you don't wait on mail to come in. So certainly that's a trend we're seeing across the board, where voters are opting in to drop off in person closer to election day. So I think definitely lessons learned in other states would be beneficial to Michigan, and as you contemplate how to best roll this out, considering some of those trends in other places and best practices that exist. So, and I'm happy to help with resources or what have you on that.
Excellent, thank you. Are you ready to Sedwig to AVR?
Yep, I'm always ready to do that.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks, everyone. Obviously, this is not the last chance to talk about any of those issues. So for those of you who are on the phone, I emailed around, in addition to the main PowerPoint, there's also a zip folder that has a bunch of driver's license and voter registration type forms. We're going to be looking at some of those, so I will try to point out which one I'm talking about. There's also an additional set of slides in that folder, which are some slides that Whitney and her team put together based on some testing we did, which I pulled out a few of those that I think are going to be helpful for us to look at. So I just want to start off by giving everyone a sense of kind of what our target is to have automatic voter registration implemented. It's going to be kind of phased in a couple of different stages. Our focus over the last few months has been on the new applications at the branches. So that is really like your sort of typical motor voter. You go in, you get your driver's license or personal ID card for the first time, or potentially an in-person renewal, and you are registered to vote. We do have a good motor voter system, but I think we can beat it with AVR. We are getting pretty close after a couple of rounds of testing, which I'm going to get into in a minute, to having the first versions of those out. There is a bit of a lag in printing, which is why we probably can't get it in before August, but that's where we hope to be. The next thing we're probably going to do in pretty short order after that is the online renewal and updates. That's a relatively easy lift for us, because we really just have to change the programming on our website where people renew and update their driver's licenses. I'll get into that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. And then September, October, I would like to, this is something we're going to talk about in more depth, but to the extent we can incorporate renewals and updates for people who are going through the graduated licensing process, that is, people who are approaching 18. If we can set up a system to get those people registered, I think we could probably do it pretty quickly. So I think we should be able to do that by the fall. All of these dates sort of dependent on decisions that that may delay or speed up the process. Then towards the end of 2019 is kind of the last phase of the last step in the first phase of implementation, which is the mail renewals. Can somebody mute their phone? Sorry. So this is, I had mentioned this at the last meeting, but this is kind of the biggest processing challenge for us because of the way that our mail renewal forms and updates work for most people. We're either going to need to change the form or change the envelope or do something that's a bit more of a processing change. So that's why that is going to have to wait a little bit longer. The last thing I want to flag is, 2019 is not going to be the end of the story here. We're doubtless going to learn some things that we need to change, but we're also going to have just some new tools and technology that are available to us. One of those is the fact that we're going to have some of our license holders, our enhanced license holders, which I'll explain, able to do that online. That'll open up more AVR opportunities for us. And then we are going to be replacing our entire driver database for driver's license transactions in the next couple of years, and that's going to open up some opportunities to us as well. So the next slide is the dates for new applicants. Just a little more detail on this. What we're doing right now after testing is trying to get in the final stage of our revisions for our DE36, which is the driver's license form that most people use. That's the standard and real ID, what we call a real ID license. That's used by about 85% of our applicants. Also our enhanced ENH license, which can only be used for citizens. That also is real ID, but it allows you to do additional things, including like crossing to Canada, which I just used it for when I went to Toronto. So we're going to try to have that up to speed, and then the ED74, which the election clerks know as kind of the blue and white, which is what we have used to register people to vote, but we're going to be turning into more of a receipt because we will no longer need people to sign that. The June-August period, after we finalize these forms, based on our testing and your feedback, we're going to be using that sort of lag time for printing to make sure that our branch staff and our clerks understand what's coming, to do any kind of last-minute programming and logic testing we need to do in terms of transferring information from the branches, and then figuring out what we need to do to sort of assess the impact of this, because again, we want to be able to determine what's happening. Hopefully we'll be seeing more registrations, but if something's going wrong, we want to know that, because we've seen that in other states where sometimes the initial implementation is not what you'd expect. And then hopefully by August, we will have the first phase of these implemented. The next slide is sort of what we're going to do with renewals. As I mentioned, the online renewals and updates for standard and real ID compliant licenses is actually pretty straightforward for us, because we really just need to change the programming on the website to an opt-out, and we're going to be able to do that probably mostly based on what we've already done with the branch forms. The other thing that makes this a little easier is that you have to be a citizen to use the online renewal, so there's not really the concern of an ineligible person getting registered by mistake. The one drawback is that really just because of programming issues, our enhanced license holders won't be able to do this online until 2021. The good news there is that it is only about 15% of our license holders. And then the other thing we're going to consider with this is, I'm going to talk about in a bit, online voter registration. We may want to time this with that, even though it'll be working a little differently. There are some commonalities there, so it may be easier just for public understanding or whatever reason to just do them at the same time. The next thing that we're going to do, again, I'm going to get into this a little bit later because this is a discussion point, is if we do have a process we can use through the mail with our graduated license holders to register them at 18 or 17 and a half, that would be something we could theoretically do pretty soon, because we probably would be creating a new form to do that. We wouldn't have these programming issues we have with other mail renewals. It could happen when people get their last graduated driver's license, which you typically get sometime after your 17th birthday. It could happen upon the expiration of the graduated driver's licensing system, where you get your regular license at 18. We're still considering some options, but whatever we decide to do, we can do pretty fast. And then, as I mentioned, we have this problem with the mail renewals, which is that we have a really streamlined form, which we put through a remittance processor. So in order to make the mail renewals work with an opt-out that someone is actually going to look at and be able to read, we're going to need to change the way that's processed or have a bigger form. So that's kind of going to be the final phase, just because it's a little harder to figure out. And then again, following 2020, we'll have more functionality available. So with the branch transactions, this is what we've been doing for the last couple months, and Whitney and her team, we've gotten a lot of feedback from our subcommittee on AVR, also from a couple other members of the group here, Whitney, Natalie, some of the people who aren't here today, have given us feedback on this. But we also did some testing in the branches of a couple different versions to see what was working. So if you pull out the packets that I gave you, and for those of you on the computer, if you look starting at the file, the document that says DE36, this is the DE36 we're looking at there is the top of your packet. It's the driver's license form that most people fill out now. This is, standard or real ID. There's nothing about voter registration on this form. You just use it to get your driver's license. With AVR, we're going to have one signature be your driver's license application and your application to vote, unless you opt out. So what you see if you look at the next page, and for those of you on the computer, it's DE36 tested 523, is what we have our current best shot at this based on the testing. You'll see that we have put the eligibility requirements sort of front and center at the top. We've tried to, as clearly as possible, explain what will happen if you do not check the box. We will register you to vote unless you check the box below. And then we've also emphasized, do not use my information for voter registration. The other thing you'll see is a bigger signature box. We've incorporated some sort of the federal requirements for affirmation on the signature. And then on the right, we've also added some clarifications of the fact that some of the information for registration is public, like your year of birth and street address, but some information is not. If you now, Ginny, do you have the other slideshow, or whoever's doing the slides, the CCD slides? For those of you who are on the phone, this will be the other slideshow, the CCD slides.
I did not print.
Oh, you don't have those up?
But I can.
Okay, well, you have them in your email, right?
Yes.
Okay, we can come back to it. Let's just go through the other enhanced driver's license then. So the third piece of paper you have here, if you're on the computer, it's DE36 ENH. This is the driver's license application that people who are applying for enhanced licenses are using. The main difference is, other than the fact that it sort of looks different, it's actually blue in real life, but it's gray here, is that you're agreeing to have a chip in your license. The other big thing here is that although you have to answer yes or no to the citizenship question for both kinds of driver's license applications, for the enhanced driver's license, you have to be a U.S. citizen to get this. So no one is going to be using this form who is not a U.S. citizen. If you look at the fourth page, very riveting stuff, obviously, for somebody who's putting me on hold. Do you want to can somebody? Yeah, I think we can mute them. Yeah. So if you look at the. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now they can't hear us, though.
They can hear us.
They can hear us if you don't mute it. Yeah. Okay. So
people are texting me. It's not me.
So if you compare, if you look at DE36 enhanced. So for those on the phone, this is DE36 enhanced tested 523. The main difference here between this and the DE36 is that we have moved the residency in this version over to the side where we talk about privacy issues and public information. The logic here is basically that because these license holders, you cannot fill this out unless you're a citizen. It's a sort of attempt to streamline what the typical applicant sees as they're moving through the application. And this one tested pretty well. Okay, so we're now in the testing. So I just want to talk about sort of what we did with the testing for both of these forms. For those of you on the phone, we're now in the other slideshow with the Center for Civic Design slides. We went on 2 different dates, we went to 8 different branches across the state. I don't know if you have this, you can look on with me. We went to 8 different branches across the state. We did try to kind of get a pretty diverse. David's telling us that they can't hear us on the phone. Okay. We did try to get as diverse as possible, a group of branches, both in terms of sort of urban, rural, a demographic mix. We did find that, we did find that, okay. We did find that most people, by the time we got through sort of a couple different rounds of testing, were starting to understand the form pretty well. But if you go to slide 4, sorry, if you could just skip ahead to slide 4.
Sorry.
4th page.
Where'd it go? Page down?
Can you all hear us now on the phone?
Am I in the right?
Yeah, actually, can you skip that one for now? Sorry. If we go to slide 4.
Yeah, we can hear.
Okay, so for those on the phone, we're on slide 4 of the Center Pacific Design slides. We found that a lot of people, and Whitney, feel free to jump in for any of this. We found that the first version of this, you can kind of see on the slide, we had more information in there, and it was just so jumbled in there that people really were kind of bypassing it. I think, you know, in fairness, it was the case that some people were just bypassing no matter what we gave them. But for the people who were kind of really looking at it, sort of giving it a good faith shot, I think that a lot of people kind of saw all this ink packed in here and were sort of skipping it. So we moved, the first thing we did was try to move the information and kind of rearrange it. But that didn't really solve the problem because we still had all this information packed in. So then for slide 5, if you go to slide 5, this is, we started to make some progress with this version. Yeah, go ahead.
So, the problem was that all the information was needed, it was just, it wasn't in the right, so the first thing is, let's get through eligibility, right? Because people scanned that real quickly, and then they needed to know what to do. We were telling them what to do before they'd gotten to that point. The other thing was that the skip, if you're already registered, was really confusing here. And given, it's sort of a trade-off about who you're gonna put at risk. In Michigan, because you do address updates no matter what, there's really no risk. If someone checks the box, doesn't check the box, and they have an address update and they're a registered voter, they get updated. So we were trying to not do anything to encourage people to skip checking the box. The other problem was that the whole challenge of designing AVR is this decline. And, you know, as people said, checking the boxes when you want to do something, not when you want to not do something. And that's just built into AVR. We just put a little emphasis in bold on the do not to try to encourage it. People, as we tested, we had them fill out the form and then talk to us about it. By the end of it, they were actually telling us accurately pretty much what the form was asking them, which they weren't at first, right? So we were getting to a point where they were beginning to say, right, it's asking me, you know, if I want to not be registered to vote or do want to be registered to vote, and I should check the box or not check the box. And we're getting the right answers from them about those questions and the right statements volunteered. So we may still have the phenomenon we've seen everywhere, which is people who think they're already registered and believe they don't have any updates, check the box because they're trying to save the government work in some way. Doesn't matter here. They're already registered, they get updated or not get registered. But people who wanted to be registered or said, well, if I wanted to be registered, this is what I would do, were giving us the right answer. And I think the key here was both eliminating a line so it wasn't sort of multiple contradictory statements about what to do, and getting the flow in the right order. I mean, there just wasn't much to it than that. The other thing I should say is that we were worried about the statement off to the side, because that's actually a risk protection statement for anybody whose address should not be made public. We did see people glance at it. A few people read it. A lot of people said, yeah, it's illegal stuff over there, which is basically what it is. I think some of the next testing that we'd like to see, or maybe consultations, is to make sure that people who, if we can get into places where we've got people who are in address protection programs or should be in address protection programs, that we make sure that they see what that is. The problem with saying it too clearly is that the minute you say your address can be kept private, you get inundated with people asking for their address to be kept private without qualifying for the program. And so there's a little, how do you do a dog whistle that works well enough, doesn't scare anybody off, but gives people accurate information.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a very helpful clarification. Thank you, Winnie. So the other thing, so I guess, can we go back to 5 for 1 second? I just want to point out a couple little things we decided to tweak. You'll notice that revision 2 looks a little different from the sort of draft DE36 in front of you. We tried to close that gap a little bit because people are trying to sign there, which we don't want. And then we also tried to emphasize the do nots next to the box because again of this sort of people looked at it closely, they understood it was an opt-out, but a lot of people, again, sort of intuitively were thinking, well, you know, wait, if I sign something, something doesn't happen. So we're trying to help kind of get closer to that. So we made a couple more revisions, and what you see in front of you on the DE 36 is kind of our best crack at that right now.
You did have a lovely. So have you
Yeah.
tested this part then? The new revisions, like revision 2, have you tested it?
Revision 2 is what we tested, and then revision 3, what you have in front of you, I guess, would be revision 3 in a sense. That has a couple of small changes. Yeah.
We
Yeah.
did have a lovely moment when there was a pair of 15 and 16-year-olds waiting for their friend to get his driver's license, and the 16-year-old was sort of cutting off, and the 15-year-old sort of punched him and said, "You dummy, this stuff is important."
So the other one, I just, you know, we also did test the enhanced version. This is slide 6 now. This one, really, people seem to be getting it. I mean, you know, the benefit of this one, from my perspective, is you don't have as much ink to look at because we have put the qualifications out to the side. Again, this is for people, you have to be a citizen, so we're a little less concerned with making sure they see that really clearly. But, you know, we have gotten to the point where we think, through our testing, we've gotten this about as streamlined as we can get it. So that's what you see before you. The slide 7, this is really just reiterating what Whitney was talking about, but this is kind of how we've handled trying to balance the information about privacy, tell the people who really need to know it that it's there, but kind of get it out of other people's way. You know, again, pending Whitney's comment about, we probably would like to get a little more feedback on this from the groups that would really be closest to those being affected by this. On slide 8, I just want to flag these things because we thought they were interesting. Slide 8 and 9, you know, we did notice a lot of things actually about the existing driver's license application. It's just a little hard for people to use, even before you get to the voter registration stuff. People were having a little trouble figuring out, like, why do I have a different mailing address? They were having trouble fitting in their phone number and email, which is something that's going to be really important for us down the road because we want to collect that, as we talked about before. Also, on the next slide, I guess, Christy Dugan, who's still here, I think, had the good sense to actually ask some of our branch people for their input on this. I was afraid to do that because I didn't want to make the lines longer, but Christy didn't care. So no, but we got some good feedback from one of our branch staff that sort of pointed out we should think about trying to separate them so that, you know, if you look at your forms, you'll see that there's kind of a branch use only section. If we can try to get it so that the customer has one side of the page and the branch has the other side of the page. Which there is a little bit of a challenge for that because we have so much information to pack on one page if we do that, really for the branch staff side. But we are going to look at sort of some other lessons just for driver's licensing that we've gotten out of this going forward. So the other piece of this is the ED 74, which is the blue and white. Sorry, if you go back to slide 3 now, that was out of order. I apologize. The other thing we need to change here, if you're on your computer, this is the ED 74. If you're here, it's the stack of blue things you have. The ED 74 is the blue and white. It's what we've used typically to register people at the DMV, and it's kind of just a voter registration form. I mean, it's a motor voter form, so it's streamlined, but you have to sign it, you have to register to vote, and then we would then send that to the clerks. This is now going to be replaced with more of a voter receipt. And so what we're looking at now is kind of the best way to actually use that as something to reach the voter and still give something to the clerk. We tested 2 versions of this. The first one is the second page there, which is the, and if you're looking at on your computer, it'll be like the ED 74 tested 425. That's where we've sort of kept the same orientation where the top third of it goes to the voter as a receipt, and the bottom 2/3 goes to the clerk. We don't really need to give the clerk that much space anymore because the reason they had that was really for these signature stickers, which that we don't need anymore. So we also tested, Center for Civic Design, tested a version where we kind of flipped the orientation, so we're now giving the voter 2/3, so we can give them some cool icons and tell them a little bit more about what it looks like. Most people thought this was really intuitive and made a lot of sense, and I think overall, if we don't need to send signatures anymore, we can take advantage of this extra space to give it to the voter. The problem we have with this, and going back to the other slideshow now, is that we do have, you can go to the blue and white slide, we do have kind of a programming issue with the way this is printed, where some of the information on this ED74 is actually pre-printed.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out if we can actually use this sort of better looking version now, or if we have to wait until we can do a different processing method.
Yeah, you're
So-
getting to that wonderful point when you ask
Yeah.
them, well, what do you, you
Yeah.
hand them this, your transaction set,
Yeah.
what do you think this means? They'd look at us like, well, duh.
Yeah.
Which is always the moment you want to get to, when they think, why are you even bothering to ask me this question? And they liked the idea that it sort of had a process to it. They could, that the 3 bullets made them think there's a process.
So that's sort of where we are with testing the forms. We think we're getting pretty close to what we can do, the best version of what we can do based on what we know now, but we definitely want your feedback on what we've done. Sort of one of the remaining issues and sort of the discussion point we want to talk about is, what are we going to do for applicants who are under 21? And that's the next slide. So, the problem is we have the way driver's license transactions work, and this is assuming people have driver's licenses, not personal ID cards, but let's just, for the sake of argument, just to talk about driver's licenses. Typically, we do not see that person in person between the ages of 16 and 21. They come in at 16, they get their level 2 graduated license, which is like their driver's license, but it's still kind of probationary. And if sort of everything goes normally, they don't have any problems, any kind of violations or anything like that, they get mailed something, the level 3 license, at some point after their 17th birthday. They could be 18, most people are probably 17 when this happens. And then at 18, you exit the graduated license process. But we don't really send you another license then, you don't come in, but you just sort of are out of graduated licensing. Currently, we start, under the old system, we do motor voter at age 17 and a half, which is the same way it works with other forms of voter registration. But we have this issue now where, we sort of have a few different options. I mean, we could ignore the graduated licensing process and only register people when they come in or when they renew at 21. The problem with that, though, is we do have an obligation to register people, and there's an argument that there's a legal obligation to it. There's also just a policy problem of we're missing the most important years to register people through the licensing process. Did you want to jump in?
May I just underscore that
Yeah.
the constitutional language says you have a constitutional right to be automatically registered to vote as a result of conducting business with the Secretary of State regarding a driver's license. So our position, and we welcome feedback on it, is that conducting business with the Secretary of State, if that occurs at the age of 16, that is sufficient to trigger when that person in our system turns 18 that they're registered to vote because they conducted business with our office regarding a driver's license at 16.
Perfect. Yeah.
So,
Okay.
That's
Just wondering
great.
if anyone has any feedback.
Right. So yes,
So-
would love feedback on that.
So that's our position. And we, will put protections in place to ensure that they're not on the rolls until that date occurs when they are eligible under law. But we don't see anything in the law that says there's any time limit, I guess you could say.
So that with that, we have to figure out what's the best way to actually make that happen. So one option would be to treat their transaction sort of at 16 as kind of that's the opt-out, and we sort of put you on some kind of pending list until you're 18. That's one option. The benefit of that is we have them there in the office. So the downside is that a couple of years go by. We do also have interactions with these people though between that. So we have
The graduated
something that we
license.
send them at 17. We have an opportunity to reach them at 18, and so we could use a kind of more of a renewal process to either give the opt-out then, give them more information about it. So those are kind of what we're looking at now in terms of what's the best way to actually accomplish this for people so that they know it's happening, so they get registered, but they have the opportunity to opt out.
Right,
So
so-
these are our points of interaction.
Do we allow the opt-out, or do we do both? Opt-out at the, when they're getting their license at 16, say when you turn 18, you won't be automatically registered to vote unless you opt out. And then when they turn 18, when we add them to the registration rolls, because they're now eligible, what type of notification do they receive then?
So, yeah, why don't we do, yeah, let's do some.
I guess
feedback.
that my thought is just
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
automatically register them, when they're 16, and then
Pre-register.
Pre-register, yeah, pre-register, and then when they reach the age of 18, or when you're following up with them as they get very close, then you give the option to opt out. I think it's just more efficient, because otherwise, they might change their mind, obviously, between age 16 and 18,
That's a
and why
good
not
point.
just get a more real-time, current response
That's a
from
good
them?
point. So if they were to say, I opt out at 16, it may be irrelevant when it comes to, when they turn 18, they're actually registered. so.
Right, and that's really when it's happening anyway,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So-
And that also gives us another reason to communicate with them, is to say, you're now 18. Unless you hear from you, or unless you opt out, you're gonna be automatically registered to vote because of this transaction that happened in our office when you were 16.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nick?
I kind of think the opposite. I think you ought, first off, I don't understand why the form reads, the concept of automatic voter registration to me is you register to vote when you get your driver's license, unless you say, I don't want to. This form says, do not use my information for voter registration. Why can't it simply say, I do not want to be registered to vote? And that's what you check, so that you're making it very clear that
Yeah.
you're registered to vote. If you tell me you don't want to be, well, then you won't be. I don't want to, not I don't need to, or don't wish to, or I don't, it can't be used for information or all of that. I think that complicates it.
Whitney, do
I
you
don't know
wanna?
if you tested that, but I think you ought to
Yeah.
think about that. Secondly, on the pre-18-year-olds, I mean, that was the discussion we had at the last meeting. You ought to, the form can be the same, and they simply get transferred to the qualified voter file on their 18th birthday or 30 days before their 18th birthday as law. If you want to remind them that at any time they can opt out, I mean, the fact that you're registered to vote doesn't require you to vote, as we all know, in this state. In Australia, yeah, but not in this state. So it's really not an inconvenience to the individual to be registered to vote if they didn't want to be, but they can always opt out. You can give them that second opportunity, but I think at 16 or whatever age, and a lot of kids are waiting till older age to get their driver's license now, we're finding statistically. So they are closer to the 18th birthday anyways. Ask them the one time. If you want to remind them of that when you provide them the additional information, I don't have a problem with that. But I think you just do it all at once and be done with it, and we publicize this as what it was meant to be, automatic voter registration. When you get a driver's license, personal ID, you're registered to vote, unless you say to us, I do not want to be registered to vote.
So on the wording, Whitney, do you have?
Yeah,
or-
so working backwards on the pre-registration, it's one of the few things that we've seen government do that produces really joyful responses, and people are like, hey, I turned 18 and they knew I was ready to vote, because they've forgotten that they checked or didn't check that box, and it just seems like a miracle that somehow the government knew you were ready to be a voter and you can be a voter, and whether that happens by contacting them or just doing it is kind of immaterial to that. The language, do not use my information, it's been used in a bunch of states, so it actually has been working pretty well. The reason that language existed, and I would maybe love to see it change, is that there's a queasiness around this being an application, not a final registration. And that's just sort of gotten mushed around through various lawyers and sort of nitpickers on the language. There's also the other thing we try to do is kind of break up the language so we don't say the same thing. We will register you to vote. I do not want to be registered to vote. And we wanted to get the do not up front. And that was sort of, it could just be do not register me to vote. I think that would be fine, actually.
Yeah,
But does anybody have, are there queasinesses around the fact that this is an application to register to vote?
My sense is that's what you do. We will register you to vote unless you check the box below. That's the redundant language, because that's what makes it look like a registration. If you simply have a box that says, I do not want to be registered to vote, not, I don't want to register to vote, because that suggests it's a registration, but I do not want to be registered to vote.
Yeah, but that begs the question of how you would have to get registered. We've actually tried it.
You are registered.
We've actually tried it. It's more complicated. If you don't explain what's gonna happen and how it will happen that you become registered.
Then say, rather than saying we will register you to vote, you say, you are now registered to vote.
You're not
Check
now
here
registered.
if you do not want to be registered to vote.
So I know you guys are both on the subcommittee that's, so,
And
yeah.
I am a
think
lawyer,
let's-
and I
well,
worry
let's-
about legalese.
Sure. So we can take some of this conversation to that,
That makes
and
sense.
also, because I know we're running
Yeah.
a little bit behind schedule, but I think, the bottom line is, we're investing a lot of time and thought into developing these forums, as you can tell. And so I think we'll continue to weigh these, and also we've got the Youth Advisory Committee that we're developing as well, that we'll also be consulting with when it comes time to do so. So I think there's, that, you wanna talk
Yeah,
about
so,
online?
yeah, so the forms aren't final, we definitely want your comments still, so, you know, not to
Yeah.
get the short shrift, but please continue to have that discussion. I'll just quickly go through online, to let you know kind of where we are with this. I think this should be on our main slideshow, which is now off. Okay. So for online voter registration, it's not part of Prop 3 per se, although there is a statutory requirement that we provide online voter registration. We are shooting for a fall implementation for online as well. It would be really great to be able to time it with some aspect of AVR. What we're doing right now is talking to the DTMB, which are kind of our tech experts in our tech services. We really would like to do it all in-house. We haven't ruled out using vendors if we need to, but plan A is to use DTMB. So a couple things that we're just sort of looking at as we're in the planning stage. You know, we do need to it does need to interact with our driver database for when people provide their driver's licenses, so we can verify that. I would like to have it so that people get real-time feedback, so if there is a problem with their driver's license, it doesn't, you know, they don't have to wait to find out till weeks later. Another thing that would be really nice would be to have, we do need to have it be able to upload into the qualified voter file, but we also want to have it connect to what we call the Michigan Voter Information Center, so that you don't have to go to a different place to like see if you're registered or find your registration status or register to vote. You just put in your information, and for you, it's just telling you all those things, giving you all those options. So those are kind of some of the technical things we're looking at. In terms of access, you know, we want to. There's a lot of interest in making it compatible with third-party voter registration groups, whether that be through an API, which is something they can basically use to take their software and plug it into our voter registration system. There's also the option to use a unique URL that you can sort of have customized websites that people can use that go into ours. A couple other things, and Whitney or somebody will tell me if I'm missing something important here. But we're just, you know, we want it to be something that everyone can use and is compatible with a lot of different options. You know, including down the road, you know, verifying with something other than driver's license. I think it's important to have that functionality in there. And then I think, did we have one more slide on this? And then, you know, usability. We want to have as many features on it as possible. So, you know, to the extent if we are going to have everyone able to use a permanent AV application list or whatever we're calling it, that would be good. You know, other things that the voters might want their clerks to know about. You know, this is not a complete list, but we want to sort of start big and make sure that we are building with all the functionality that we're going to want to have on there. So those are some of the things that we're sort of on our wish list. We're waiting to hear how fast that can happen, but we haven't had any immediate concerns about any of these things, which is good from our service providers. But you know, this is just an opportunity to make sure we have the full list of everything we should be thinking about as we're designing this. So either now or in the coming weeks and months, please let us know what we need to be thinking about as we design our online system.
Jonathan, I just want to go, I know I met with you two a couple of times on this very issue. Sorry, I talk low. So anyhow, we have mapped it out, just so you know, and we're at a point where we're kind of figuring out what the work ethic or effort would be for this. So I think it's all very doable, though.
So I think with that, we'll take a break.
Yeah, unless,
We'll take a-
yeah,
unless
yeah,
there's
are we on
any other
schedule or
feedback.
behind?
We're far behind.
We're far behind.
So what we're gonna do is take a break, and then we've got, after the break, talking about voting from home, which we know is you wanna kind of engage in that discussion refreshed and energized. That's a big one. We'll touch upon military overseas voting and then end with public education and engagement. So let's take maybe, 10-minute break?
Yeah, let's try to make it 10
minutes?
since we're late. Let's try to do, let's try to do 10.
Because we only got an hour.
Yeah, we're 15 minutes behind.
Want to be in control of that during yours? Or do I guess?
I think Jonathan, I got pretty good. So I was just trying to. You guys are good. We can go on at military schools if you want, and then just do it.
And Justin Roebuck's section.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna take over.
I guess they
and-
left.
And Steve is here. Steve can fill in.
But really, I can fill a little time until they're here to talk about the other topics. The Forms Committee, of which we have many members in this room, I think maybe someone took my Forms Committee list and recruited from there. We've been working on redesigning our vote-by-mail ballot envelopes. As you can see from your handouts, we have had every vendor that supplies election supplies in Michigan has the return and outgoing envelopes. They all have the same basic information, but they're designed a little bit differently. There's just two examples on the screen. I did want to point out that these look a little wordy, and that is based on election law. And so you'll see some highlights of what sections are dictated directly by election law. So we had to work around that, of course. This is the back side of the return envelope. There's some more required language there. But we, with the assistance of Center for Civic Design, have made a new return and outgoing envelope. And so this is an example of one side of the return envelope and the front side of the return envelope. And then we have the back side of the outgoing envelope. And the front side of the outgoing envelope. We used pretty much everything that the Center for Civic Design recommended in terms of color and size. It took us a little while to get there, but we're pretty close to being done on that end. The law also requires ballot marking instructions in with each ballot, and our jurisdictions each do this a little bit differently. Some use an insert that they've created or a vendor has created, or they use a secrecy sleeve that has the ballot marking instructions written on it. Also required by law. These are some more examples of secrecy sleeves. They're all a little bit different, but this one in particular, this instructions for absent voters is,
Use your phone. Use your phone. Hey. I guess Detroit, is that Detroit?
It wasn't that funny.
Yeah. I mean, these are instructions for absent voters. We are confident that what's written in law and required to be put in with every ballot is thoroughly read by each and every one of our voters. Some of the current outgoing envelopes are designed with this on it, and then some of our secrecy sleeves have that on there. So we're moving that off of those outgoing envelopes because, as Center for Civic Design pointed out to me, that's what you throw away, and now all of a sudden you don't have your instructions. But also it's a lot of words on something that's a little more, we could have a little more informative.
The fewer the better.
Yeah. I would love to see some legislative changes.
That first one was even longer than the New York instructions, just saying.
And it's, So legislative changes would be needed to get rid of, not necessarily get rid of them, but at least make it more user-friendly. So those would still be required. So some of the decisions we made, using the white color instead of the craft color, blue for outgoing, green for incoming, and that is something that Center for Civic Design is working with working on nationally with all of our other states, which is I think will be very helpful from a U.S. Postal Service training standpoint. We know that a blue envelope goes to a voter and a green comes back to a clerk. That might be a nice visual cue for them. And then a smaller size. None of our ballots are wider than 8.5 by whatever, lengthwise, and 8.5 inches wide. Our envelopes right now are much larger than that widthwise. In the post office, even though our current envelopes meet the standard for first class mail, they're right at the max, and so you'll get some postmasters saying they're too big. Moving to that smaller size really puts us in a place where they don't have that excuse anymore, or that argument. So,
Ginny?
yes.
Just real quick, white versus craft for what?
For the color of paper, and I didn't bring my examples. So those first examples from the vendors, they're on craft paper. Actually, you know what? I think I do have them with me.
So you're talking about, you're not talking about the envelopes, because you just said the envelopes are gonna change colors. So
No.
you're talking about the secrecy sleeve? But that's
No,
the only-
the envelope has a background color, and there's a stripe of color on the side. There's an outgoing color, and USPS is actually has been pretty enthusiastic about this, because it helps them with the bounce back problem. There's multiple colors, but green is the default for the return envelope. You could have a tan color for UOCAVA if you wanted to be able to distinguish those, and it's that
So we're
stripe on the
talking
side.
about the stripe when we talk about blue and green, yeah.
And
So
in
craft,
fact,
this is our
Yeah,
current
I know that's
version.
the current, and that's craft.
Yeah.
And if I would have anything to say, it would stay craft, but I'm just me.
And in fact, in some of the states, they've used a pink or a yellow, so every ballot that has an envelope, every envelope that has a ballot in it looks like this with the color stripe on the side, and the color stripe tells you what kind of thing is inside there, right? Is it a election day not confirmed, or is it a provisional, or so on?
So just to finish up real quick, and then we can talk about all of
I
this.
just was curious what you were referring to for white
Yeah,
craft,
no,
sorry.
that's a valid question, because it is a big difference. So we are piloting, St. Clair Shores is going to pilot in August. Then we've had some issues with our vendor who's going to assist with the pilot, so they are actually going to be testing it on the craft paper because our vendor couldn't get the white, so we figure that will give us a good U.S. Postal Service feel for if addresses are in the right place and all of that, and making sure this has been vetted by the U.S. Postal Service mail design experts, so it should be, but we really want to see a real test of that. And then testing the actual white with voters. I talked to Whitney today about a good process for that, and they already have something in place, so we can utilize that to get some feedback, just like we did with the AVR forms on that. On those forms, make sure that voters understand them, and make sure that when we mail them, they know they're getting a ballot, and all of those types of things. And then we have many other jurisdictions who were willing to pilot in August until things fell through. So they'll pilot again in November with the expectation to roll out in 2020. So, Mary?
Jenny, this doesn't address, I'm assuming, I think, page 3, the new return backside, new return front side. This doesn't, we didn't change anything about where the voter sticker is gonna be, and it's nice that there's a striped bar on it, but the machine doesn't read a striped bar. It reads whatever address side is up, and that's how ballots that are supposed to be returned to us are getting mailed back to the voter that mailed it.
because their sticker is on there that we need, and then they rip it off so that the ballot doesn't come back to them again,
So-
and you get a ballot with nothing.
We certainly took that into consideration in part of the design part, and I think Whitney can probably
So the
answer better
color
than
stripe
me.
doesn't have anything to do with orientation, except visually for humans.
I know, but the machine's who sorts it.
The automation, so the automation reads three things. It reads the FIM if it's available, right, the little facing identification mark. But the other thing that it looks for first is an IMB, and it reads the IMBs from the that's the FIM. It reads the IMBs from the bottom to the top. So on the front of the return, that's your IMB. On the back of the return, there's two IMBs. The one above the voter address, actually go up a little bit.
Oh,
The one
this
above
one.
the voter address, that's the voter's IMB if you're using one.
And most people
And
don't
it
use
shows
it in
through
the
the
state.
window. The one at the bottom is your IMB. It's hidden in the envelope. On the outgoing envelope, it's invisible because it's hidden behind the outside of the window. And so whichever side it's got, the lower right corner has the correct IMB to get it back to you.
And the barcode that you're referring to that comes out of QBF, if placed correctly,
Goes right
and that's
there.
why we're trying to make sure we've got the guide. If it's higher, it won't be red. It shouldn't be red anyway. It's not the same format
Right.
as this. So when the
Yeah,
Postal
Postal will not
Service
read
is telling
anything
us
but
it's
an
reading
IMB.
that, they're telling stories to, you know.
I know Postal is not
I'll keep
covered
a
itself
tally
with
sheet for
glory,
you.
but they're trying really hard.
Any, do I have any other comments on it? All right, so, Joe and Justin, I hear this is your category, and now that you thought you were gonna, not be in here when we started and get out of it.
We were waiting to be done.
Chris left, the clerk who processes AV ballots. Do you guys have any concerns that you wanted to talk about as far as AV processing go? What do you see coming? What should this committee be concerned with?
I mean, I think and my apologies, I didn't know we were covering this as we stepped out, but I think our biggest issue as we've kind of looked down the road, and I think this was touched on right out of the gate by the secretary this morning, was, looking at the ability that we have to process those ballots. And the reality is we as an election administration community have wanted no reason AV for a long time. But I think there are some logistical challenges that we have because we've been put in this box for so many years of the more restrictive absentee process. We need some tools in the toolbox as election administrators to count these things. And I think there's a reality that in a presidential election, as Chris is saying, if we're going to see turnout as high as 50% greater in the AB margin, what are we going to do with that? And I think we have discussed a number of different things, and I know that some of those things were on the notes that Jonathan had sent out earlier from the AV subcommittee as well. But allowing some sort of option or an opt-in for a central count system where there may be smaller jurisdictions who have absentees, or maybe who do not currently have absentee counting boards, allow them to contract with the county to allow for a centrally counted system. I think that, and this is something that I've been saying for a little while now, and I think we need an option to count absentees before the election. And I know that's been brought up a number of times today as well. I think we can do it safely, we can do it securely. There are a number of other states that do this now, and there are already processes written out for us to do it safely and securely that we can kind of model our own process after. But even giving a window of a couple of days, when you think about that, that's a huge margin. So Ottawa's a little bit different because we own our own equipment, and so we began looking at this, and Steve Deitch is here as well, who's my election director in Ottawa, and we began looking at this from the perspective of we're going to have to, as a county, purchase more absentee equipment for AV counting boards. So as we're breaking down the numbers and saying, well, here are the numbers AV's processed in this jurisdiction, here's what this looks like with a 50% increase, with a 25% increase, with a 75% increase, it's costing a significant amount of money. And so I think that is an option on the table, or should be, hopefully, perhaps, a legislative appropriation for more funding for equipment for absentee counting boards is important. But we also believe that probably a more cost-effective means of getting that done would be allowing the option for jurisdictions to count absentee ballots early. And then I think we really do need to take a look, and I know a lot of us at the, Chris Swope and Mary Clark and others who are, participating in the Council of Election Officials have talked about this as well, allowing for the possibility of a greater number of voters to be allowed per precinct. So in other words, the cap is 3,000 registered or active voters in a precinct now. Well, depending on how many absentee voters we have or how many vote by mail voters we have, we really need to look at the option of probably having less physical precincts. So giving us the tools, in the toolkit to kind of, not all this has to be mandatory, but it certainly would help our local and county election administrators to have some of those options at the table.
Yeah, and we're not on the forefront of these progressive election reforms. I mean, other states have done this long before we have, and the data shows that when they went through these reforms, no reason absentee, et cetera, that absentee numbers increased, and they increased significantly, especially in presidential and gubernatorial elections. So it's not going to be a surprise to anybody when these numbers dramatically increase, because they did in other states that have done this. I think now, which we didn't have before, I think now with the new voting systems, we have the safeguards in place as part of the technology to prevent the machines from being closed prior to a specific date or time, and to prevent reports from being run before 8 p.m. On election night. And so the concern that some may have, and perhaps the legislature may have, is that, then folks will be knowing the count, they'll be running reports, they'll be seeing, so I think the counter to that is, well, this new equipment has, technology is evolved, has safeguards in place to prevent that, and maybe it's a shorter window. I mean, maybe even if it's Monday and Tuesday, that's 2 days, that's doubling the processing time that we have now. Even that is a small start, a foot in the door is something better than what we have now. So I agree with everything Justin said, and would just add, those points that the old days are kind of over with the voting equipment that we had, and this technology and safeguards now are significantly better.
Do you foresee, anybody in the room, do you foresee 2 days of processing anyway, whether it's Tuesday and into Wednesday, rather than Monday and Tuesday? I mean, do you, are we really looking at, we're gonna be processing AV ballots through the night and into Wednesday? Is that the reality that we're facing?
Yeah.
Could very well be.
It's possible.
I think it's possible.
I won't say it's likely.
I think it comes down to how prepared and organized people are, and
Right.
What
Yeah.
lessons have already been learned and how they're applied, how those lessons are applied. But I think it's certainly possible.
I will say too that I think, and there may be some differences of opinion in the room on this topic, and as to counting absentees after the election, obviously ballots that have come in before election day have to be counted either way. But in my opinion, we risk a trust issue and a perception issue every time we are every hour we're spending after the close of polls counting ballots. Because this whole perception that absentee ballots don't even count until it's closed.
Or the outcome changes.
Exactly, or the outcome
now
changes
send
once absentees begin being counted. So I think it's, I would rather be proactive on the front end of of an early process versus opening ourselves up to that risk of needing to count ballots after close of polls.
I agree, and I think if we go to, like, if it's a 2-day processing period, and, I mean, the reality is, if we get Monday, for instance, rather than taking Wednesday, it's not that the bulk of these ballots come in on election day. So, I think we're gonna be able to be proactive, it looks better, and why not? Like, when you said, are we looking at 2 days of processing anyway? I kinda chuckled, cause it's like, yeah, so why don't we have the option to start counting on Monday?
I stole that from Georgia Detroit, by the way.
All right, yeah.
So Elizabeth has been waiting for a while, and we have Amber on the phone too, and I have Nick too. Do you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, I may be a minority here. I have concerns with starting to count prior to Election Day, the AVs. Part of my concerns are the ability of a voter to change their vote. Once it goes through the tabulator, that is not a possibility, and I think that was mentioned. The other concern I have is we then open ourselves up to, yes, allowing dead people to vote. My process and procedure in the Livingston County Clerk's office is at 4 o'clock on the night before election, we start going through EDRS records of people who passed away from the end of the prior month to election date. We're going through those records and preparing a list that we ship out to the local clerk so that anybody who passed away, even up to the weekend and the Monday prior to election, those names are given out to the local clerk so that if the deceased voted absentee ballot, that ballot can be polled. If we don't have that ability and they're not alive on election day, you then do have dead people voting.
Well, Elizabeth, I just would note that really a law talks about when a ballot's cast. And so, once the definition of cast is that it goes through a tabulator. So there's a lot of states that have early voting where people are coming in for 2 weeks or 3 weeks before putting their ballot into a tabulator. That's voted, that's cast. They die before the actual election day. Obviously, nobody's going back to get that.
But that wasn't constitutionally passed in Michigan.
No. It's all I'm saying is that legislatively, when you start, this would take a change. So that by definition, then you just say, well, when is the ballot cast? And that would then back it up to, say, the Friday or the Saturday or Sunday. And then that would be kind of your cutoff.
And then I have heard even my counterparts mention is optional. And I do think optional is key because those jurisdictions that don't want to start that should not be mandated to start processing.
Yeah, some won't need it, right.
Early. Some will not need that.
Sure.
Correct.
Can we have Amber on the phone? Had a question or comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, most states that either have a significant amount of early voting or vote by mail, when you cast your ballot, cast means you submitted it to the election official in both of those cases, and so if someone passes away prior to election day, they were still eligible when they cast that ballot, just as it was election day, and they voted in the morning, and they passed away in the afternoon. That has happened before too. So I think that as long as they were eligible at the point when they cast the ballot, that's really all that matters on that piece, and that's how most states around the country kind of have applied that standard, especially those of us that have had a significant amount of early voting or vote by mail over a long period of time. So I think that kind of, and if there needs to be a statutory adjustment in Michigan to handle that, then that makes sense. In terms of the vote by mail increases, certainly, and we have a lot of data for this at Vote at Home, and maybe in a future meeting, I'm happy to kind of walk through more of this in terms of best practices, changes to operations, that kind of thing. But I would even argue more than 2 days, because if you look where there is a significant amount of vote by mail, there is time that goes into signature verification, processing those ballots, prepping them, and there are plenty of best practices out there to secure the results so that you can, determine who that is, and you're really just scanning, you're not tallying. So those two things are very different, and there's plenty of examples of this being done is delayed, you do risk confidence and trust. And so I think there's certainly opportunity here to talk about why that kind of operational shift and change in the law perhaps needs to occur, because you don't want to get to next year and have it going late and confidence erode and all those things. So happy to help engage on this discussion, because we have a lot of data on our side at Vote at Home, but I also have a lot of experience kind of in Colorado and then other states and how they're handling this sort of pre-election processing component.
Nick and then Sharon?
I like what the last speaker said a great deal. I think we should consider, at least debate, the idea that a vote should be considered cast when it's delivered rather than on election day. Because I worry, quite frankly, that there could be an error in a report of somebody's death who didn't die, so you're denying somebody their vote because you got a report that said they died. That's happened with Social Security benefits and other things across the board, so it could go either way. But we should define it in law as to when that vote is cast. The only thing I worry about with early voter registration is the fact that you've got a right to change your vote right up to election day, and you don't have that once it's put through the tabulator. In terms of the timing, I'm wondering whether we can't bifurcate some of these procedures, the verification, signature verification, and so forth and so on, from the actual tabulation, and that if anybody has looked at across the nation in terms of the amount of time that's necessary for the tabulation. 40 years ago, when I was city clerk, our absentee ballots were all cast on paper ballots that were hand counted by people who separated them into piles and did hash marks and all sorts of things, rather than simply feeding them into a machine. The feeding into the machine is a lot quicker, so there may be a larger volume, but the counting may not be as much more time consumption. The verification certainly is as time consuming, but may not be as greatly time consuming as we may be fearing, if we can somehow separate the verification process from the tabulation process and solve both problems at once. Just something I think we should kind of ponder as we go through this, so that so people would still have the right to change their vote, that we wouldn't have to be saying, did you die the day after you registered, you cast your vote? And I could walk into an election poll on election day, vote, walk outside and get hit by a bus. You're not going to void my ballot at that point because it's on election day. But if I handed it to you the night before and walked out and hit by a bus, yeah, I mean, I think these sorts of things can be handled. Sometimes we overthink these things. Could be handled by some clear-cut definitions of what it means to cast a vote, and two, trying to separate out the processes that you can do ahead of time and be done with, and then simply count, run the things through the tabulator on election day.
Sharon?
So I don't know that we're gonna have a long talk about it, but I think that part of the work product of this committee would also be to address, whether we in the future want to move towards vote by mail in a more way that Amber would describe it, where you actually are streamlining the process and it's ballots being verified and ballots being mailed as opposed to a two-part process. I understand that's revolutionary. I'm not going to the ballot next year to do that. But I think that frankly, that if you see 50% or 60% of your voters voting by the AV process, I suspect that there's going to be an interest in how to streamline that process. So I suspect that perhaps this advisory committee wants to at least begin to start putting that conversation out there. I think that's both the vote by mail in a more rigorous sense and less attached to our current absentee system, and then also what does early voting in a not attached to an absentee voting look like? Again, I understand everyone has a lot on their plate right now, but if we were to look 5 years down the road, those might realistically be things that would make sense given the shift of who, how, when people are voting. So then the second piece I would say is just given that that's not our system in 2020, we have a lot to do around the public education. I know we're going to get to public education, but particularly like making sure that voters understand these are going to be voters who have no experience with the absentee process. So all of the problems that we've seen that cause rejections and that cause challenges and mail, those are all just going to be very much amplified without enormous amounts of public education around, not just what does the absentee envelope, but like really simple, shareable graphics on like what are the tips you need to know. Sign it, sign it, sign it, sign it, sign it. Don't forget to sign it. Let's have a jingle about signing it. Also curing problems, how to cure the problems, like people have already talked about the importance of having the way to reach out to the voter that Mary mentioned earlier. But, starting to make sure that voters are tracking it through MVIC so that they can also be on the team of curing any problems. So, both I hope this advisory committee is willing to think about what's next to make these more streamlined for you all, but also what do we need to do for this presidential election, this momentous presidential election.
So your question about what additional tools do voters need, I think that my biggest concern about this influx of voting from home is the post office. And what we experienced in this last gubernatorial election, where in my 1 square mile town, it took 2 weeks to be mailed from City Hall to reach the voter. You could have walked back and forth 2,000 times in 2 weeks. It would take that long to go through the postal system. We need in states with county-run elections, counties have purchased this equipment. Here, it's going to have to be done at probably the state level. There needs to be a proactive ballot tracking system, something that instills confidence in this process. The voter, their envelopes have a barcode on it. As it moves through the process, they get text messages or email alerts letting them know where their ballot is in every step of the process. If the county rejects the ballot because it's not signed or whatever the deficiency is, the voter gets an email or text message saying there's a problem with your ballot. I mean, they don't have to do anything other than read their text messages or email. You don't have to fuss about trying to call these folks or do any of this stuff. So we've got to get, if this is where we're going, and more than half of the ballots in this state are going to be cast this way, we've got to become proactive about it. I don't vote AV. Even though like election day is a really busy day for me, I go to the polls. I'm the first one there in line every morning. I like the experience. I like seeing my neighbors. I don't think I'll ever vote AV. But if I did vote AV, I would want a system like that in place to protect my ballot, and I know where it's at through the process.
I think that is something that's on the secretary's radar now, and I believe Detroit is actually looking into buying something for the city of Detroit that does all of those things. That doesn't help everybody else.
No.
But I do think that is something that the secretary is already.
Yeah, we're definitely, but that's something that we want more input on. I think we should move to the last topic, but I see a couple people have their name cards, Nancy and Mary.
To follow along with what Joe said, one of the big problems I have in our county with AV ballots is not all city and township clerks put on the postage how much it costs to return it back. And that's caused a lot of problems because when they don't know what it takes to send it back and they only put one forever stamp on it and it really took 76 cents or something, there's always those kinds of issues. And that's one thing that I struggle with even myself, because I ask, why did the township clerk get to send it out at 65 cents and then I had to pay 78 cents? Well, because she got the bulk rate, I didn't. But I think that that's another thing on absentee ballots that's extremely confusing, especially to senior citizens, especially to people who don't keep stamps in their homes and things like that. So I think that that's something that either needs to be consistent, where they're telling us how much it's going to cost us to return it.
So Mary's going to have the last word on this topic, and then we'll move on to engagement.
I just want to clarify, as a person that actually processes ballots that comes in, how the process works. And the signature is not, the ballot is not verified as part of the tabulation process. If I get a ballot back 30 days out, it is the signature is verified at that point and it is scanned in. We have, if it comes in on September 1st, it is verified and scanned in, so MVIC shows it in on September 1st. So there is no big batch of 10,000 ballots that are signatures verified on election day before the ballot's put through the tabulator. So I just wanted to clarify that because it's really very different than the conversation that's, ideas have been put on the table.
So, you know, again, don't want to give this short shrift by any means. Please keep the comments coming in. We'll circulate
Can I
and
just
through the
say one
subcommittees.
thing?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Jenny, go ahead.
I think it's important for all of you to know, though, that we are starting a lean process improvement on the processing of absentee ballots on the back end, right? On either in the precinct or AV counting board with tabulator, AV counting board with high-speed tabulator. We'll be having focus groups of clerks participate in this process. We'll have clerks participating in the lean process itself. As a way for us to get better training materials, find those efficiencies across the state for that process. So we'll be working on those things, and I'm certain that as part of that, there will also, it will also include all the wish list things that we have for law changes to make that more efficient.
So our final topic is public education and engagement. We had a couple people we were gonna have facilitate. Sharon has generously volunteered to help us with this conversation. We also are joined at the table by Loida Tapia, our public engagement director. And so I'm just gonna, and then obviously this is something that Ginny and a couple other folks in our Bureau of Elections also have experience with in terms of election official communications. So I'll hand it off to whoever wants to speak first.
Can I just say, how long
Yeah.
do you want us to go? Because right now is when we're supposed to be stopping.
Yeah, I
Do you
know.
want us
I
to take
think
15 minutes?
I'm
like
gonna
was
say
originally allotted?
I would suggest that we plan to go till about 4:10, and anyone who needs to leave can leave. Obviously, we're not gonna lock the doors, but without objection, that's what I would suggest.
Okay. So am I starting? So it's Ginny and
Yes.
Okay, I'm starting. Okay. So this is a huge interest to me. You know, voter education is what organizations like the ACLU and the NAACP and the Proposal 3 organizations do a lot of, but we do it in partnership with election officials, you know, from the state level to the local level. So, and we have, as I said on the call, we have many voters with questions when we have never changed the rules for 30 years. So imagine how many questions and what the education sort of curve is for this coming sort of election cycle, both this fall and then, you know, into 2020 when even more voters are participating. You know, in addition, there are issues that are not changing about our law for which we have not adequately educated people. What am I thinking of? I'm thinking of the right for returning citizens to vote in this state. We in this room all know that, but sadly, I'm sure many of you have been in the room. I have been in the room with very knowledgeable folks, not election officials, but knowledgeable voter education type people who did not know that. So there are new rules, there are old rules that folks still aren't quite getting. And then I think there's also an opportunity to do what I describe as drive people to the solutions. Like tell them tell them, of course, by when they must, you know, return a ballot per the law, but give them a recommendation of when they should put that ballot in the mail. That to me is really, I think, our job in the public education sphere. You know, if we tell folks you can put it in the mail technically, you know, by Monday, but Joe knows it takes 2 weeks. We would call that malpractice in my business. We would call that. So you know, there's those 3 sort of big areas. I think as I looked through the notes from the meeting, I think some of the other things that we talked about were, you know, making sure that folks are educated on where to get help. As someone who is not a clerk, not an election official, that is what I do a lot of. But maybe this year, the state should take on more of that. Maybe the help center, you know, should be something more where it's directed to an election official. Not to say that the nonpartisan, the partisans, the civic, not that they're not still going to answer questions, But, maybe there's a bigger role for state and other elected officials to be answering those questions. Whosever job it is, we have to make sure people know where to get help, right? They need to know when they get turned away, which they should never get turned away, where they need to go. I think we also have talked about in a variety of these subcommittees, uniform messaging. How can we use this collaboration between the public and the private to adopt uniform messaging? It doesn't make any sense for voter advocacy organizations to be messaging in a way that does not work with your election administration practices. I think, as I told Whitney, I have repeatedly heard the 4 touches. To educate people on these rights, we're going to need 4 touches between now and March, or now and November. There are a lot of ways that we can do that. That can be, through social media, but it can't only be through social media, as Martha and others have reminded us. Social media does not work for everybody, but it is very inexpensive, right? So it can do a lot of the work for us. But what are the multiple mediums? What are the multiple ways? What are the public service announcements? What are the trusted messengers? I am not the messenger for everybody, right? We are not the right messengers in every community. And so how do we get the uniform messaging and then train the trainer onto those organizations and those community groups and those civic and faith organizations that actually can be the trusted messenger? And I think, the last thing for me, when the Secretary and I both went to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission hearing, I had a chance to read her testimony afterwards, and I didn't realize that we had said some very similar things, which doesn't exactly surprise me, but it made me smile as we were reading it, which is, the importance of acknowledging who's not participating in our voting system and making sure that as we do public education, we are keeping that in mind. And so the way I describe it is education to address equity issues, right? If we know that new voters are having more trouble with absentee voting, let's make sure that we're really using those mediums that reach to those voters. Of course, there has to be education for everybody, but how do we use education as a way to address equity issues that clearly exist in our voting and turnout and registration system? Did I steal all your thunder?
No, I love it because it's a great introduction to all the wonderful things that I'm hoping to accomplish, and I need everyone's help in this room to make that happen. So we'll start off on your last point, the education to address equity issues. So I think the last time I was here, we briefly spoke about this low precinct project that I'm putting together, and it's actually well on its way. So my first week here, I worked with the Bureau of Elections to pull data on the lowest performing precincts across the state in the last 4 major elections. We identified the top 100 precincts that continuously came up in the last 4 elections, and now we're going to do a pilot program. We've pulled 10 of those precincts randomly to see what are the best methods to go into those communities and educate the people there. We want to do the 4 touches there. In my plan, it's 3, but I'm hoping to collaborate with partner organizations to do as many touches as possible in these communities. Last week, I went to Flint with our Assistant Secretary of State to meet with the clerk, and we did an environmental scan of our 2 precincts. Well, we did of several precincts, but of our 2 precincts within our pilot program to see what do these communities look like. And who can we partner with? We want to create a community ambassador program to have local trusted people talking about these issues and addressing these issues. The Secretary wants to go into all 100 precincts, whether it's events that we put together and organize in these communities, or whether it's existing events that are happening and we stop in and start talking about these issues. Now, we know that some of the communities we're looking at are not going to want to talk about elections first, but if we go in there with a message around driver responsibility fee, then we can have a conversation around elections. And so we have to be mindful of the communities, but we need to connect with our local leaders, and we need to connect with our clerks who know these communities the best. Inez Brown in Flint was wonderful because she knew the history. She's been a clerk there for over 30 years, I believe, at this point, and she knew the community, and she knew where to go, and she knew which churches we needed to talk to. And so in 3 weeks, I'll be back in Flint to talk to those community leaders about the work that we want to do there. I'm also partnering with the University of Michigan in Flint because they have this great GIS program, and they mapped out the entire city. They know the demographics, they know everything about the city and the population, and we want to make sure that we're data-driven and we're being innovative about the policies that we're trying to implement in these communities and the way that we're coming in to speak. Returning citizens, I'm glad you brought that one up as well. We're working with the Michigan Department of Corrections to increase providing identifications and driver's license to those leaving the system. And as part of that, I want to have a civic engagement education, at least information provided to them as they're leaving the system, knowing that they have voting rights and that they can vote in the next election, because if we're giving them their driver's license, or their identification, they're automatically being registered to vote, right? So the information that's going to be provided to them will say, you're already registered. The next election is X, right? And we want to make sure that we're proactive in providing that information. Uniform message. So I met with Sharon, NAACP, the League of Women Voters, and several other organizations, large organizations that do this civic engagement across the entire state. And we took this form, which I know you all have seen and have provided feedback on, and we asked for their feedback, because if we're collaborating with organizations that are educating communities and educating the state on what they need to know, we know that they will use this information. And we had a deep discussion on whether we would call it early voting or vote for home, and and a lot of other phrases came up as well. But we want to make sure that we're collaborating with our partners, and they are well aware of what we're doing and the messaging that we have, and that they're using that same platform and that same message, and that we're sharing this information across the state. And so we are using as many of these tactics to really engage and inform, are what I think are the most underserved communities across the state. Now, all 100 precincts are not in a centralized place, but many of them are in Flint and many of them are in Detroit. But I'll be reaching out to you, for the clerks in the room at least, to know which ones are those communities that we're really looking into, and I'll give you all the information that we have so that we can have a deeper discussion on how we can reach out and educate and work along you to really figure out what's the best tactic in reaching these populations. So those are some of the things that Sharon mentioned and what she would like to see, and that's kind of the platform that I've put forth, in addition to many other things that we will be doing around civic education and civic engagement. I think there was one more person that was going to.
Well, do you want to talk about poll workers, or should I?
Oh. Poll workers,
Yeah.
yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, so I'm sure various people have opinions and things to say about this, and I want to open it up for the remaining time we have. But just one other point that we wanted to cover here was, the importance of poll workers, election workers, and all of this, and both the engagement and the education aspects of what we're going to be talking about here. And this is a big initiative of Secretary of State as well, is to really have a big poll worker recruitment and education and training push. And the end goal really is to have some kind of centralized recruitment training structure, where we can bring in schools and companies and partner with people, give people days off. A huge part of that obviously is a needs assessment from the election officials, so we can get as good a sense as we can about, who needs more people, who has needs for more highly trained people or people who are more comfortable with technology. That's not necessarily going to be, we're not necessarily only going to be responsive to that needs assessment. I think we want to really create a huge talented pool of poll workers that we could sort of push to people whether they ask us or not, but it's also really helpful to kind of know where the needs are. So with that all in mind, and sort of building, building on the stuff that Ginny and others already do to train, our election clerks, what do we need to be thinking about to make that successful? And that's there's some overlap there that was already discussed, but it's also kind of a separate point.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing I wanted to throw out there. And then, what other thoughts, Ginny? I don't know if you had something to add, or if we want to see what other people think.
I think all of what I covered earlier in training really kind of covers that, but I do think there needs to be an overall message of what all clerks do, even, just broadcast statewide, and because one for the election inspector recruitment piece, because they don't people don't know that's an option. You know, I can't tell you how many times people had no idea they could volunteer. I don't know what they thought the people that were there, how they got there, but they just don't understand that this is a concept, this is something to do. And I think our millennials are very much civic minded and like to do things like that. We're getting a new generation that's interested in being helpful with things like that. So an overall education to voters about, you know, there is this thing that exists, it's called your local clerk, and I think motor voter's been really successful in our state, and that has created a little bit of a disconnect with the local clerk, because everyone goes to the Secretary of State's office, that's where they register to vote, and somehow they don't always get that translation of what the clerk is, who it is, where it is, what, you know, why they're important to the rest of the election process. So you know, I think that's a good education piece, and quite frankly, I think it'll probably help a lot of you in the effort to recruit temp workers. You're gonna need more temp workers.
So in the area of education, one of the problems we were having in Muskegon County is, you're absolutely right, people didn't know where to go and apply to be an election inspector, and in some cases, some clerks didn't want them to apply because they had the same people they've always had and everything. So I reached out to Joe Roselle, because I felt with a title like Oakland County Elections Director, that gives some credibility, and it wouldn't necessarily be me. And I asked him to prepare a training program and to come in and train. And what we did was we had free community training. They signed up, they used the Secretary of State's sheet to register, and the only difference was they returned it to us, not to the municipality or the clerk where they lived. They didn't get paid for coming. At the end of the training, they received a certificate saying that they had trained. When they came to the training that morning or afternoon, we offered a morning and an evening, they had to show us their driver's license in order to participate and come on in, so we'd know they were who they said they were. At the end of the training, they received their certificate, which meant they were good to do it anywhere in the state of Michigan for the next 2 years. That being said, we let the clerks go on and do what they were gonna do, but then we sent to them the list of everybody, Democrats and Republicans, and the copy of their registration that they had submitted to us, and those local clerks hired so many off of there. Then when that was done, we also contacted Ottawa County, because we felt that some of them would be willing to drive to Spring Lake or Grand Haven, and we reached out. It was so successful in 2016 that we did it again in 2018, and not only did we do it again in 2018, but we did it again in 2019, because suddenly we said, we're gonna have a county-wide, we've gotta teach these people that have a 2-year certificate, what's been changed, and one thing and another, and I just can't convince enough people, because we've trained almost 70 every 2 years, or every time we do our community training, and we just have to step out and do it, because it's a missing link, it's an important tool, and it's something we all gotta get involved in. Especially as the need gets greater and greater for all these things that are going on.
Nancy told me about that innovation, and I know Chris told us last week about some innovations, which is Chris puts not the whole application online, but he puts an initial like inquiry form online. This is Chris Swope in Lansing, and so he said, correct me if I'm wrong, Lori, that they found that hugely valuable to increasing recruitment, and it also meant if they were trying to find folks who were technologically able and they were recruiting them through the internet, that they were probably going to have a decent chance of getting folks who were comfortable with an electronic poll book, right? So it allowed them to target a subset of folks. And I guess both of those examples maybe say to me, it sounds like we could do some work to find out what all the innovations are that are already going on by clerks all across the state, and then maybe try and distill those into a couple of best practices, right? I know when the Detroit clerk reported to her council, the city council, in her budget preparation, she was talking about, the continued struggle. So it's the struggle, of the smallest clerk to the biggest clerk in the state, and it's not particular, as all the national folks wrote, it's not particular to Michigan, right? It's a challenge all over. The other thing I really love about that, doing it all the time and doing it sort of well in advance of an election, is you are pulling people into that public education force. whatever they are doing in their lives, in their faith communities, in their civic communities, they are fully educated and they can be out there answering all those questions and intervening.
And
on
we're
some
not
of
paying them to come and be
You're not paying
trained.
them, right.
The only thing we're paying for is the rental facility, because we try to get a new rental facility. We have it in the morning and in the afternoon, and I don't even know that we even, I think we had little small 8-ounce bottled waters, but we kept our cost really low because we wanted to be effective and things like that. And we did give it also to the announcement to the clerks and the media and everyone. We asked them to help recruit and have people come to us that they'd been reluctant to reach out to before. And I think that this is the way we're all gonna have to keep moving.
More opportunities to bring people in.
Yeah.
All the way up to the Secretary of State level,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Did we wear them out?
I think so.
Okay.
So Chris is going to close this out. I think I'll just say, I know one of the things, you know, we went a little bit over. So one of the things we did want to come out of this, going back to the Secretary's initial point, was kind of a work plan, and we can, both a work plan for us and also sort of a list of topics we want to make sure we've kind of surrounded. So we can do that through some kind of follow-up, and I'll do that. But just keep that in mind. If there's things that, you know, you're not sure we got to, that we didn't get to today, you're not sure we got to in subcommittees or the prior meeting, please keep that list, send it to me or whatever, and we can make sure we get that incorporated. But with that, I'll just hand it off to Chris to close us out.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming, and thank those of you on the phone for bearing with us. I do agree that we've covered a lot of topics today, some of them very small, some of them really big, you know, going to court to challenge things, down to, you know, procedural things. What I'd like to see is, there's a lot of folks here, we've been keeping notes, is that we pull together what we got today and send that to you. And you then, if there's something on that's not on there, that you get back to us right away. So if we didn't hit all of the high points on our list, we want to make sure they're on the list. Because this next step, as Jonathan indicated, is now to start honing this down into recommendations. And like I say, we hit some very significant ones today. So Prop 3 was just the beginning. That was the easy part, right? As we recall. And it's behind, that part's behind us, and it now launches us into a much broader area where it points out some additional shortcomings in the system. It points out the need for us to be better connected with voters and citizens who are not registered. It points out data that we need to collect so that we have a better idea on how we're administering elections. So all of this, I think, has come together in the last 2 meetings, plus the subcommittees. And so we'll get that list out to you. You get back to us with things that still belong on that list, or clarify things that that may be vague on there, so we can then take the next steps. And I don't think we really want this to go on and on and on. We've made progress from the first committee meeting to the subcommittees to this one, and I'm sure the next time we meet, we will be looking at a list of some really finite recommendations and finish up with that, if that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Safe
everyone.
travels on the way home.
Thank
Oh,
you.
and take food. There's food you can take with you.
It's packaged, it's
Yeah.
ready to go.
Yeah.
No boxes.
And you're allowed to have the vegetarian sandwiches now.
Yeah.
It's okay.
They're still growing.
See ya.